The UK has voted to leave the European Union in the most seismic decision in generations. In the last hour, David Cameron has announced he will resign. 52% of people who cast a ballot made the momentous decision to leave the EU. A short time ago, the Prime Minister gave an emotional address explaining his decision.
I fought this campaign in the only way I know how, which is to say directly and passionately what I think and feel, head, heart and soul. I held nothing back. I was absolutely clear about my belief that Britain is stronger, safer and better off inside the European Union. And I made clear the referendum was about this and this alone, not the future of any single politician, including myself. But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
Leave campaigners are jubilant at the result, saying it sends a stinging message to the European Union's political elites. The Remain campaign called the outcome a catastrophe, as it suffered lower than expected support across swathes of the Midlands and the north of England. The Governor of the Bank of England says he will do what's necessary to support the financial markets and is making available £250 billion of financial support.
So David Cameron said he's going as the British establishment reels from its biggest slapdown in modern history. Who will replace him at number 10? I'll be asking leading politicians what happens next. And what now for Labour and UKIP too? And what's the future for the UK outside the EU and for an EU without Britain?
Here in Manchester, we will talk to voters about the momentous decision that some of them have made and the dramatic ramifications. There really is quite a sombre mood in here now after David Cameron's announcement, including from Leave voters. So we will ask about people's hopes and fears for the United Kingdom now.
Good morning from Downing Street. After more than 40 years, Britain has voted to end its membership of the European Union. The vote itself was close, but it was decisive. 52% chose to leave the EU, 48% wanted to stay. Just over half an hour ago, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, stepped out of number 10 and said he would resign. In an emotional address, Mr. Cameron said the will of the people must be respected. He said fresh leadership was required with a new Prime Minister in place by October. As the result became clear, the pound plummeted to levels not seen since 1985, and more than 120 billion was wiped off the value of the financial markets when they opened this morning. Well, the final result shows that Leave won by more than 1 million votes. Overall, 17.4 million people voted for the UK to leave the EU. That compares with the 16.1 million voters who backed Remain. More than 72% of eligible voters took part. In England, more than 15 million people voted for the UK to leave the EU. 13.2 million people backed Remain. In Scotland, every voting area came out in favour of Remain. 62% of Scottish voters backed Remain, with 38% backing a Leave vote. In Wales, Leave won over 52% of the vote and secured the most votes in all but 5 of the 22 counting areas. In Northern Ireland, the only part of the UK that shares a border with the European Union, voters backed Remain, with 55% of voters choosing to remain in the EU. 45% voted to leave it. Well, that is how the results look right across the UK. We will, of course, be discussing in great detail what it all means for you, for the United Kingdom and for the European Union. But first, our political correspondent Carol Walker reports on the night's dramatic events.
There was no hiding the emotion as David Cameron with his wife Samantha emerged from Downing Street.
Good morning, everyone.
He said the will of the British people must be respected. But as he had fought and lost the campaign to remain in the EU, the country should have a new Prime Minister.
I fought this campaign in the only way I know how, which is to say directly and passionately what I think and feel, head, heart and soul. I held nothing back. I was absolutely clear about my belief that Britain is stronger, safer and better off inside the European Union. And I made clear the referendum was about this and this alone, not the future of any single politician, including myself. But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction. I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination. This is not a decision I've taken lightly, but I do believe it's in the national interest to have a period of stability and then the new leadership required.
With turmoil and uncertainty in the financial markets, the Governor of the Bank of England said it was prepared to take further action to support the British economy if necessary.
The best contribution of the Bank of England, the best contribution we can make to this process, is to continue to pursue relentlessly our responsibilities for monetary and financial stability. These are unchanged, and we've taken all the necessary steps to prepare for today's events, and in the future, we will not hesitate to take any additional measures required to meet our responsibilities as the United Kingdom moves forward.
From the moment the results started coming in just after midnight, there were big wins for Leave.
Ladies and gentlemen,
across the northeast, the Leave campaign did far better than predicted and pushed Remain into a narrow victory in Newcastle.
65,404.
A much smaller win than expected.
Votes cast in favour of Leave was
in Basildon in Essex, it was another big win for Leave.
151.
And a big turnout at 74%. The result in Flintshire reflected the outcome across Wales as voters backed Brexit. But Scotland voted by a clear majority to stay in the EU. Scotland's First Minister said it was clear that the people of Scotland see their future as part of the European Union. The results will bring fresh calls for a second referendum on Scottish independence. Northern Ireland, too, has voted to remain in the EU. Sinn Féin has said it intensifies the case for a vote on whether Northern Ireland should leave the United Kingdom. London was the only region of England to support remaining a member of the EU. It was shortly before 5 o'clock this morning that it became clear the UK had taken the historic decision to leave the European Union.
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU.
UKIP's leader, Nigel Farage, said he was thrilled that the country had decided to break free from what he called a failing, dying European Union.
17 million people have said we must leave the European Union. We now need a Brexit government. A government that gets on with the job. A government that begins the renegotiation of our trade relationship. A government that will be mindful that already many of the German car manufacturing unions have said, let's get on and do a deal.
The Labour leader said he hoped the negotiations with the European Union would include efforts to protect British workers.
We now have to try and protect the working conditions that we have in this country, and in the negotiations with the European Union try to obviously ensure there are some trade opportunities for Britain, because clearly there are some very difficult days ahead. The value of the pound has already fallen, and there will therefore be job consequences as a result of this decision.
Thank you very much.
A momentous day for Britain, for Europe, as the country embarks on a new and uncertain future outside the EU and under a different leader. Carol Walker, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, we'll go to the city shortly and speak to our business editor, Simon Jack, who is monitoring events there. But first, let's talk to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, who's with me now. However you voted, the scale of this is extraordinary.
This is the biggest political decision in our lives for anyone watching this. This is a momentous moment. It is one of those sort of signposts in our island story which marks a different direction. And we are in effect closing one chapter, which is our 40-year membership of what was the common market, now the European Union, and consciously deciding to step in another direction. And we don't know where that will lead. We do know that it means carving out our own way, not part of this much broader European club, and there are all sorts of implications in terms of how do other countries see us, what are our relations with them, because those now are all utterly changed. What are our trading relationships with other countries? What is the position of the city? Do we manage to get a hold of migration? And how do we feel about ourselves as a country? In the short term, you know, you can still go to the pub, you can still fill up the car, the sun will rise, nothing will change. But pretty swiftly, we will have to get into negotiations which, if things go as they're meant to, should be over, done and dusted within 2 years. So it is possible by the summer of 2018, we could be out.
So many questions, so much uncertainty. Just in the short term, what happens next?
In the short term, there will be discussions between Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and the Prime Minister. I would expect those to take place probably later today. Mr Cameron, to all intents and purposes, is now a broken Prime Minister. He is just there, I wouldn't say a hostage, but he is sort of in the grip of his sceptics, and he will have to do what they want. Some are saying they want a cabinet reshuffle to bring in the Brexiteers, and then they will decide the course of the negotiations, which probably won't begin, I don't think, until we get a new leader. Now, Mr Cameron has said he will be gone by the start of the party conference, which is the beginning of October. What that basically means is the leadership contest begins now, because under the rules you have to have about a month to allow the members to make the final decision. The MPs narrow it down to 2 contenders. Parliament goes into recess at the end of July. Well, we are pretty much at the end of June, so it begins now. And I suppose Boris Johnson must be in pole position to become our next Prime Minister.
Norman, for now, thank you. Well, just after the Prime Minister spoke, the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, came out and sought to reassure financial markets. Speaking in the past half hour, he said the bank was well prepared.
A few months ago, the bank judged that the risks around the referendum were the most significant near-term domestic risks to financial stability. To mitigate them, the bank has put in place extensive contingency plans. And these plans begin with ensuring that the core of our financial system is well capitalized, is liquid, and is strong. This resilience is backed up by the Bank of England's liquidity facilities in sterling and foreign currencies, and all of these resources will support orderly market functioning in the face of any short-term volatility. The bank will continue to consult and cooperate with all relevant domestic and international authorities to ensure that the UK financial system can absorb any stresses and can do its job of concentrating on serving the real economy. That economy will adjust to new trading relationships that will be put in place over time. And it's these public and private decisions which will determine the UK's long-term economic prospects. The best contribution of the Bank of England, the best contribution we can make to this process, is to continue to pursue relentlessly our responsibilities for monetary and financial stability. These are unchanged, and we've taken all the necessary steps to prepare for today's events, and in the future, we will not hesitate to take any additional measures required to meet our responsibilities as the United Kingdom moves forward.
Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, seeking to reassure the markets. Well, as the result became clear, the pound plunged. It's the biggest one-day drop in 30 years. It fell to levels not seen since 1985. Simon Jack, our business editor, is monitoring the markets in the city. Many of these bankers, traders up all night, but they weren't expecting this, were they?
No, this is really where the shockwaves were first felt, and on a morning and the evening of astonishing news. As you say, sterling plummeted. It had its biggest one-day fall ever, really, since they started floating currencies in this way in 1972. It fell 10% at one stage. You can see it right behind me. This is the moment, and when we had the question, who's got it right, the polls or the City and the bookies? Well, the City, they were basically banking on Remain here. They got a nasty shock when Sunderland came in. We had the Wandsworth bounce, and then it fell down. And so in the question, who was right, the polls or the bookies, the City got it wrong and the polls were right. And if we look now at the stock market, you can see that opened at 8 o'clock and immediately fell by 500 points, the knock-on effect there. Now, in both cases, it has found a level and is making a bit of headway. It's now just down 3 1/3% on the morning, and I think that message from Mark Carney really did help. Some of the bank stocks, Barclays was down 35% this morning. Astonishing. Some of the house builders down 40%. And I think that reassurance from Mark Carney saying, don't worry, I've got your back, the Bank of England stands ready to help, really did reassure some of the markets, and we've seen them make some ground. But on any scale, a truly shocking morning. And the chat round here, we've heard from people like JP Morgan saying they may have to move staff over to Europe, because if they need to have European staff to serve European customers, now that we're going to be outside the European Union, they may have to do that. But obviously, those negotiations will take weeks, months, in fact, even maybe years to conclude. But yeah, that's the chatter around here on an astonishing morning in the city, Sophie.
Huge changes ahead, clearly. Simon Jack in the city for now. Thank you. Well, throughout the morning, politicians have been reacting to the result and to the Prime Minister's resignation. For some, Britain's decision to leave is a moment of great excitement, of triumph, a result that they have been fighting for decades. For many others, it is devastating, a seismic shock, something they never wanted to see. Well, let's go now to College Green here in Westminster and my colleague, Andrew Neil.
Thanks, Sophie. We're joined now by the Secretary of State for Defence, Michael Fallon, who campaigned for Remain. Given that the Prime Minister lost, given that we now need somebody to negotiate the terms of our divorce, was it not inevitable the Prime Minister had to resign?
Yes, you can argue that you needed somebody who'd been part of the Leave campaign. I personally think the Prime Minister, actually, with his negotiating skills, would have been the best person, but he's taken that decision. I think it's an honourable decision, given the result went against him. And now we've got to get on and make this work.
Your Brexit colleagues in the Tory party who derided Mr Cameron's deal for the renegotiation would never have accepted him negotiating our divorce terms.
Well, maybe some of them, but most of them, I think, signed a letter saying they would support him staying on. And I personally think it's a very sad moment for our country that one of the great reforming Prime Ministers is stepping down. But there it is. The decision has been taken now, and we all have to make it work.
Is Boris Johnson now the man to stop as the next leader of your party and the next Prime Minister of our country?
Well, he's clearly one of the men to start. I mean, he'll be one of the candidates. There'll be other candidates.
Is he not the front runner?
I think the great strength of the Conservative Party is you'll see a range of candidates come forward, and I think it's a bit too early to start allocating the odds.
What about Michael Fallon? Is he thinking of throwing his hat into the ring?
I'm certainly not going to be putting my hat into the ring, but what you can be assured of is there will be a number of candidates who will come forward, be selected by the parliamentary party, and then the entire membership will have a vote and decide.
You're in for a leadership race this summer, aren't you? It's going to be more blue on blue.
Well, there's a leadership race. We've done these things before. We've done it amicably. And I think there'll be a huge determination now in the Conservative Party to pull together again now. We've got 3 months before a new government is formed. We've got plenty to get on with in delivering the manifesto on which we were elected last year.
If Mr Cameron's on his way out, as he told us he was this morning, can George Osborne be far behind?
Well, there'll be a new cabinet, and that'll be for the new Prime Minister to decide. But George Osborne has been steering us away from an economic catastrophe, has been reducing the deficit year by year, and has been delivering economic reform that has meant the highest employment in our history.
And can we take it that the punishment budget that Mr Osborne threatened with us with this summer, if we voted to leave, will not now happen?
Well, you've seen the turmoil in the markets as a result of the decision. So I think we were right, and the Bank of England was right to warn.
The FTSE is now above 6,000 again.
It's beginning to recover, but you've seen some of the turmoil. So I think some of those warnings were in fact justified, but it wasn't George Osborne's label of a punishment budget. He was right, I think, to warn there would be consequences, and we've seen that with sterling, and we've seen that with the markets this morning.
Yeah, but what he said was that if we voted to leave, there would need to be a budget that would increase tax, cut spending, and end the triple lock for pensions. Can we take it that none of that will now happen?
Well, I hope we're going to resume growth. I hope we'll now see investment decisions. But obviously a lot of investment was paused while people were waiting for the result of the referendum, and they'll probably wait a bit longer now to see the result of the renegotiation as to what the terms will be.
Wasn't it?
No, I don't accept that. I think
Well, why are we not going to have it? We have voted to leave. If he meant it, why is he not going to do it? Because I would suggest to you, it was just meant to scare us.
No, he warned that there would be consequences of a Leave vote. And you've seen those consequences in the markets this morning.
Well, it's 12 hours.
You've seen what's happened to sterling. You've seen what's happened to shares.
You cannot judge the future of Brexit on 4 hours of the markets after we voted to leave. You know that's absurd.
No, it's not absurd. I think the markets tell you what's happening. You've seen turmoil in the markets. And obviously, we are hoping that we can get growth resumed. A lot of decisions have been paused during the referendum, and we'll have to work hard now to encourage those who are going to invest in Britain from outside, firms that wanted to invest here with access to the single market. We'll have to work hard now to persuade them that we can negotiate satisfactory terms.
But for people watching this morning, particularly pensioners, is the triple lock still on pension increases?
The triple lock is there. It's a guarantee that we offered, but it is, of course, dependent on the economy growing again. That's vital for all our public services.
Given that you're the defence minister and that we were threatened also with armed conflict in Europe, when is that going to happen?
No, I don't think David Cameron ever spoke about World War III. What he pointed out...
I didn't say World War III. I said his words. He talked about armed conflict.
It is true.
Is it going to happen?
It is a fact that the democracies of Europe working together since the war have prevented any armed conflict that we saw brutally twice in the last century.
I was just asking if it was going to happen or not.
No, it's not going to happen.
Okay,
while the democracies are working together.
Another threat that's not going to happen.
Well, it's not going to happen while democracies work together. Now, I think staying in the European Union would have helped because it's part of the security of the West. Okay. But we will have to work hard now, and I will be talking to our allies later today in France, in Germany, in the United States to remind them that we're going to stay in NATO, play our part in the security of the West, and continue our contribution to the fight against Daesh.
All right. Okay, so far, triple lock's with us. So far, war hasn't broken out. I can hand us back to Downing Street and Sophie. Sophie.
Andrew, thank you. Well, we've heard from the Prime Minister this morning. We've heard from the Governor of the Bank of England. We haven't yet heard, though, from one of the leading figures in the Leave campaign, Boris Johnson. He is expected to speak for the first time shortly, the first time since that decisive result. We will bring you that, of course, as soon as he comes out and starts speaking. But it is the people who have spoken. The turnout was high, more than 72%, the highest turnout in a nationwide ballot since 1992. Let's hear now from the people. Victoria Derbyshire is with a panel in Manchester.
Yes, absorbing the news. Voters are the result of the referendum vote, obviously, but also the dramatic news from David Cameron this morning. Adam, you voted to leave. What are you thinking right now?
I'm a bit shocked, to be honest.
What about?
I'm shocked about both. I'm shocked that we actually had voted to leave. I didn't think that was going to happen. My vote, I didn't think was going to matter too much because I thought we were just going to remain. And the David Cameron resignation has blown me away, to be honest. I think it's been the period of uncertainty that we're going to have for the next couple of months. I think that's just been magnified now. So yeah, quite worried. Quite worried. Jules, what about yourself? You voted to remain.
I did indeed, but I would echo that as well. You know,
what are you most
shocked
worried about?
but not surprised. Well, I think the country needs a captain to steer us through this, and I would have thought that David Cameron would have been the best person to do that. You know, he obviously has got good contacts in Europe. He's been in and out of Europe a lot. He's been working with these people, and now he would have been the best person to have negotiated terms with them.
Okay.
You know.
Did Paul? You voted to leave.
I did vote to leave.
When David Cameron announced his resignation, you were pretty sombre actually, and you're a Conservative voter.
I am. I'm upset about that resignation. I've got to be honest with you. I do share what Jules says, and we were on opposite sides of the argument. That Mr. Cameron kept saying we're not quitters, and he's been the first quitter in this. I would have liked him just to stay on and fight for our position a lot more than what he tried initially.
Okay, Joanne, you were undecided for such a long time. You eventually voted to stay.
I did.
How are you feeling right now?
It came right down to the death for me yesterday. I was still undecided as of yesterday. I decided to go with Remain.
And today?
To be honest, I expected Leave to win. I expected us to leave, oddly enough, but I did decide to go with Remain. We're now in a period of uncertainty. That's going to happen now for the next weeks, months.
Are you worried?
It's just... No, I'm a positive person when it comes down to it.
Okay.
So it's a case of making the best of what we've got.
All right. More from voters throughout the morning, of course. We were expecting more Remain voters here today, but they were too upset to turn up and talk about the vote, to be honest. And one actually told us they felt they were grieving. Andrew.
Victoria, thank you very much. Well, let's now give you a proper breakdown of how the United Kingdom voted yesterday. Let's go to the BBC Newsroom and Christian Fraser.
Sophie, thank you very much. Yes, all the results are in. Let's take a look at the final show then. We'll start with England, shall we? Over 28 million people casting a vote yesterday. This sort of turnout, 74% would be good for Remain. But you can see that, in actual fact, it was a 6-point lead for Leave. That, incidentally, is the highest turnout since 1992. Look at the huge swathe of blue in rural England and in Labour supporting areas. So in Manchester, where we have just been with Victoria, that little maroon spot of yellow there, and also Liverpool, and then you've got Leeds, Yorkshire and Harrogate here, and Newcastle, but only by the slenderest margin in Newcastle. And London, yes, we knew was probably going to go for Remain. Not all of it, but most of it, and not all of the south-southeast, large parts of Kent there in blue. And I think it was in those metropolitan areas where they thought they were going to do well, Remain, in areas like Durham, in Sheffield, Coventry and Watford, that they didn't do too well at all. All of those metropolitan areas going for Leave. Let's show you the highest turnout for Leave in the country. So Boston and South Holland in Lincolnshire, Castle Point in Essex, Thurrock and Great Yarmouth, we know are big UKIP supporting areas. All of those over 70%. I can show you the top 5 Remain areas as well. No great surprise, Gibraltar over the top, overwhelmingly 96% in favour of Remain. And then the London boroughs of Lambeth, Hackney, Haringey and Foyle in Northern Ireland, which we'll look at in a second. But a very different picture in Scotland. You'll see that the map is completely yellow. Here we go. 2.7 million people casting a vote in Scotland. This, though, a much lower turnout than the UK average. Is that voter fatigue? Possibly. They've had 4 elections in under 2 years, but overwhelming the results, 62% in favour of Remain. Edinburgh, over here, 74% in Edinburgh going for Remain. We'll show you the picture as well in Northern Ireland. Of course, questions in Scotland about a second independence vote, and now questions about independence coming from Martin McGuinness in Northern Ireland, and this is why. Big stretches of yellow close to the border. Belfast, 4 voting areas in Belfast, 3 of them went for Remain, and only these parts here in Northern Ireland for Leave. 790,000 people in Northern Ireland voting, a much lower turnout than the UK average. But let me show you Wales. Dramatic picture here for Labour and Jeremy Corbyn, a big disappointment for them. Only 5 of the 22 areas in Wales going for Remain. So Cardiff, yes, but Swansea, no, and areas like Merthyr Tydfil, Newport and Caerphilly all going for Leave. And the turnout, 72%, 1.6 million people voting in Wales. And the result, the final result, similar to England by 6 points, 53% for Leave, 47% for Remain. We're churning through all those numbers. They're all there on the website. If you want to look at how your town or city voted yesterday, then do have a look at the website, bbc.co.uk/news.
Christian Fraser, thank you. Well, that is the breakdown of how the UK voted. The results will, of course, have huge implications right across the UK. Let's get reaction now from Scotland, from Wales and from Northern Ireland and find out what the consequences of the vote could prove to be. Gavin Esler is in Edinburgh, Sian Lloyd is in Cardiff and Chris Buckler is in Belfast. Gavin, let's start with you.
Well, hello and welcome to a great European capital. Edinburgh has been trading with Northern Europe for centuries. It sees itself as the Athens of the North, and it's hardly surprising that almost 3/4 of voters here in Edinburgh voted in favour of remaining. 32 local authority areas in Scotland, all 32 also voted in favour of remaining, with some 2/3 of Scottish voters saying they want to stay within the EU. However, that raises the big question, as always, the independence question. Independence Day is a phrase that's been used by those who wish to take Britain out of the European Union. Could this be the beginning of Independence Day again for Scotland? Could it be the beginning of a new independence process? Let's go over first to Boris Johnson.
Well, these are the scenes right now. These are the scenes right now outside the home of Boris Johnson, leading figure of the Leave campaign. Huge crowds, as you can see there, ready to hear what he will have to say. Chris Mason, our reporter, is there for us. I think we can talk to him now. Chris, describe what's going on.
There won't be a formal challenge.
Well, not entirely clear what is going on at the moment. The police following a vehicle down the street. We have been hoping to hear from Boris Johnson. It would have been his first statement of the morning since this decision, this vote was announced. Okay, well, we'll come back to Boris Johnson as soon as we can get word from him, but let's continue with our look around the United Kingdom, and we'll go now to Cardiff and to Sian.
Well, Wales has voted to leave the EU. 17 of the 22 local authorities here in Wales have backed Brexit. 52.5% of Welsh voters saying they want to go, 47.5% of voters wanting to remain. And it is traditional Labour heartlands, valleys communities, Blaenau Gwent, Merthyr Tydfil, Torfaen, Caerphilly, who have strongly backed a vote to leave. More affluent Cardiff, where I am now, the Vale of Glamorgan, Monmouthshire wanted to remain, as did Ceredigion and Gwynedd. They were the only other two council areas here in Wales who did want to stay in the EU. Now, the First Minister of Wales, Cadwyn Jones, has just been holding a press conference. He's been talking about what his concerns are now. Obviously, he was backing a vote to remain in the EU, as were all of the Welsh Labour AMs and MPs. He's been talking about concerns over jobs and particularly over the future, the devolution settlement here in Wales, and also about the funding that the Welsh people get from Westminster. He's saying that he believes there'll have to be renegotiations over the Barnett formula. Now, Remain had sought to convince people in some of the poorest parts of Wales, the working class communities who largely have voted to leave, that Wales enjoyed a lucrative relationship with the EU, billions of pounds in structural funds being poured into some of those communities. However, that didn't convince the voters there enough to want to stay. Sophie.
Sian, here in Northern Ireland, there was a majority vote to remain, some 56% to 44%. However, whenever you take a look at the figures and start to break them down, it seems very clear that unionists who were more likely to vote for leave got their vote out, while nationalists who were more likely to vote for stay, they didn't get their vote out to the same extent. And as a result, this wider vote, and indeed the fact that margin of success by Remain was not so big, is being treated as something of a success by the Democratic Unionist Party, the largest party at Stormont, who have been campaigning for a leave vote. They say it is a good decision, but there are all sorts of implications for Northern Ireland as part of the UK. First of all, there is the question of the border. This is, of course, the only part of the United Kingdom that has a land border with another EU country. That will now become the point where the UK meets the EU, and there are questions about what will happen there, suggestions along the way that some kind of checkpoints might have to be introduced, or perhaps even some kind of checks between the two islands, between Britain and Ireland. Beyond that, there are also questions about the economy. There are huge amounts of trade that take place between Britain and Ireland. The Republic of Ireland itself, of course, is concerned about that. The Irish government is actually meeting this morning, and we'll hear from the Irish Prime Minister Enda Kenny a little later. He had campaigned for a stay vote very, very vigorously. He had been alongside David Cameron on one occasion. He had also travelled to Britain as well. And then there is the question, of course, about the whole idea of a united Ireland. Sinn Féin has said in the outcome of this vote, they would like to see a border poll to see whether people would see a united Ireland again. The SNP may have been careful with their words in Scotland this morning. On the other hand, Sinn Féin aren't. They are saying very clearly that there should now be a poll. There are lots of questions for the United Kingdom to come.
Indeed. Chris Buckler in Belfast, thank you. Well, we saw a short time ago chaotic scenes outside the home of Boris Johnson in North London. We can go back there and try to make sense of it all with our correspondent Chris Mason. Explain what's been happening, Chris.
Yes, good morning. We've been here outside Boris Johnson's house in Islington in North London for the past 3 or 4 hours. A gathering media scrum that you saw there in the footage as the former Mayor of London left his home about 5 minutes or so ago. What was really clear, and you can hear it and see it now, is the extent to which the challenge now will be uniting a country divided by this referendum. There was perhaps, around 100 photographers and reporters and camera crews here, all of us wanting to shout questions in the direction of Boris Johnson. We were simply drowned out by a sea of boos. And what's been quite striking as people have been commuting past Boris Johnson's house on their way to work this morning is plenty shouting fairly unbroadcastable things in the direction of the front door, behind which was the man who hopes to be our next Prime Minister and could well be within the next couple of months. What we expect now is that Boris Johnson is heading to the Vote Leave headquarters in central London. The expectation is at around about 11 o'clock, although, as you know, timings today somewhat fluid. There will be a news conference featuring him, Michael Gove, the Justice Secretary and the leading light of the Leave campaign, and Gisela Stewart, the most prominent Labour MP on the Leave campaign. She is travelling back to London this morning. So that's when we next expect to hear from Boris Johnson and actually hear him say something as opposed to just get shouted at, which is what happened here.
Chris Mason, thank you. So just over an hour and a half until we hear from Boris Johnson. Right now, though, let's go back to College Green and my colleague Andrew Neil.
Thanks, Sophie. I'm joined now by Chris Grayling, Leader of the House of Commons, who campaigned to leave, and by Simon Fraser, former head of the Foreign Office. Chris Grayling, when do we get the extra $100 million a year for the NHS that you promised?
Well, it doesn't happen until after we've gone through the formal process of leaving, because that's the point at which we stop making our contribution. Now, the timetable of that is 2 years from the moment we trigger the formal process. That's clearly going to wait until a new Prime Minister is in place in the autumn. So you're looking 2 years beyond that.
So at least 2020 before we see the extra $100 million a week?
Well, no, because 2 years on to 2016 isn't 2020.
No, but you know, when would you like to trigger the Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty that would begin the formal process, sets the clock ticking for our departure?
I think we need to give it enough time to do the informal preparations to get the negotiating team ready. It's a 2-year process after that. We clearly need to complete this before the next general election. So the answer to your question is before the next general election, but I'm not going to put a month on it.
All right. Well, either way, we still have to wait quite a while to see that extra money for the NHS. Simon Fraser, how is the Foreign Office going to cope with this? It is congenitally pro-EU, and now it has to play a major part in our exit.
Well, the Foreign Office will do its job as it always does. I mean, the first thing it's going to have to do is launch a pretty big campaign around the world to explain diplomatically what we've done, why we've done it, and what's going to happen next. I'm sure our embassies around the world are already doing that task. And then looking further ahead, the Foreign Office and the rest of government, the rest of Whitehall, they're going to have to think very carefully about a very major set of tasks that lie ahead of them.
Is it realistic for the British to think they can have quite a considered period of informal talks with the EU on our divorce terms before triggering Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty?
Well, I think we do have to bear in mind that the decision that we have made affects not just us, but the rest of Europe as well, and they'll have their own interests, political and economic, to deal with. So they'll have their own priorities. I suspect they will allow us some time to sort things out, but I don't think that period of time will be indefinite. And of course, when we come to triggering it, they'll have their own fish to fry.
Well, my understanding from the Prime Minister's resignation remarks this morning is that he doesn't expect to trigger Article 50, and there won't be a new Prime Minister, I think, at least till the end of September, beginning of October. So that's several months. Could it go beyond that? Could it go to the beginning of next year or beyond before we press the exit button?
Well, let's see what happens at the European Council next week. Donald Tusk, the President of the Council, has already said that he wants to manage things calmly. My personal view is that there is not an unlimited period of time. I think it would be reasonable for this not to happen until the autumn. I think delaying it much beyond there would raise questions not only in Europe, but probably amongst the voters in this country about when we're going to implement their decision.
You say ambassadors will have to explain Britain's position around the world. I've never met an ambassador, either existing or former, who was in favour of leave, so their heart's hardly going to be in it.
Well, they're professionals and they do their job. I think it's true to say, I personally believe that from the international perspective, it would have been a better decision for us to remain, but the decision has been made in a different direction. And civil servants are highly professional people who will make the best case and do their job to the best of their ability.
Let me ask you a question I asked Michael Fallon. Can we rule out George Osborne's punishment budget, which he threatened us with if we left?
Well, the reason I don't think that's going to happen is, of course, if you looked at the small print of what the Institute for Fiscal Studies were talking about, and it wasn't actually their research, it was third-party research that they were simply referring to, it assumed that our trade with the rest of the European Union fell off very sharply. It assumed that a fall in the value of the pound led to a fall in exports, which, as you know, Andrew, is completely illogical.
So you don't think it will happen?
I don't think that problem exists, and I also think, I feel very strongly, we heard from the head of the German CBI 2 days ago, that the rest of the European Union will want to carry on trading with us on a normal basis, because we buy far more from them than they do from us.
Perhaps, rather than reading the small print of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, a bigger reason why there won't be the punishment budget is that Mr. Osborne won't be around to deliver it anyway.
Well, I mean, clearly from September, October, there's going to be a new cabinet, new people in position. I don't know what George's position in that will be. I don't know whether there'll still be Chancellor or doing something different. That we're just going to have to wait and see. But there is absolutely no need for an emergency budget next Monday.
If Mr. Cameron felt it necessary to resign, why wouldn't George Osborne feel it necessary to resign?
Well, I think that's very much a matter for George. George has been a good Chancellor. He's helped turn the economy around
since 2010.
Sure, but I'm asking for your
view. If I saw Mr. Osborne again, I'd ask him, but I've got you. What's your view?
Well, I think it's going to be a matter for whoever the new Prime Minister is to decide who fills which job in their cabinet. I don't think it would be helpful now if the Chancellor of the Exchequer also resigned. We need a period of stability. We need to calm the markets. There will undoubtedly be a change face to the government in the autumn, but let's wait for that to happen.
Who are you backing to be the next leader of your party?
I have no idea who I'm going to back.
No idea? You're not backing Boris Johnson, your Brexit colleague?
To be honest, Andrew, I was this morning arguing for David Cameron to stay. I wish he had stayed. I thought it was the right thing for him to stay. I was taken very much by surprise by his decision not to stay. I'm now going to contemplate, give some serious thought as to what happens next.
Other than Boris Johnson, who would you like to see?
Well, I'm not setting my name name against any candidate at the moment. I'm going to think it through carefully and decide what to do.
And your own name, is that, are you going to throw your hat in the ring?
Well, I haven't decided who I'm going to back at all.
No, but what about yourself? Are you going to run?
I think it's a question of who I'm going to back.
And not run?
Well, I'm not, it's too early for any of us to be getting into this today. David Cameron's only just resigned, but I haven't given any thought to which candidate I think will be right to take us through this.
Just very briefly, Sir Simon, can all this negotiation be done in two? Supposing we have a long informal period and then we set the clock going, it needs all 28 to stop that clock. Can we do it all in 2 years?
Well, I think the real question is it's not just the Article 50 negotiation. There's another negotiation about the terms of our future relationship with Europe. And by the way, I don't think that will be easy to conclude. And we will not get a deal which gives us the same level of access to the European market as we have now. Then there's another negotiation to be had with all the other countries around the world about our trade there. And on top of that, we're going to have to go through the whole body of our law and regulation, and the new government will want to decide what it wants to keep, what it wants to change, and how it's going to change it. And that is a massive set of tasks, which is going to take a very long time and consume a lot of the energies of Whitehall and Westminster.
Sounds like the Foreign Office is going to be busy. Simon Fraser, Chris Grayling, thank you both. Back to Sophie in Downing Street.
Andrew, thank you. Well, clearly huge changes, huge consequences ahead for the United Kingdom. But what about the rest of the European Union, the 27 other member states? What will it mean for them? We're not expecting to hear from the German Chancellor Angela Merkel until later this morning. But a sad day for Europe, a sad day for the United Kingdom. That was the reaction early this morning from Germany's foreign minister. The European Parliament has held an emergency meeting this morning in response to the referendum results. And in Brussels, Matthew Amriwala joins us now. Matthew.
Sophie, good morning. The shockwaves are reverberating all around this place. This is the catastrophe they had feared. It was very interesting listening to David Cameron talking about negotiations there in Downing Street when he spoke, because just in the last little while, the leader of the largest group in the European Parliament called for an immediate negotiation on the UK exit. The EU can't wait for a protracted Conservative leadership contest. That's what Manfred Weber just said. Leave means leave. Katja Adler is the BBC's Europe editor. She's here with me. And Katja, give me a sense of this moment here, the conversations you've had.
Well, people are absolutely aghast. They knew that there was a possibility of Britain voting to leave the EU, but I think in the heart of hearts, definitely the leaders across the EU were hoping that Britain would vote to remain. And, you know, you're looking at an EU that was weak already before the vote. The euro crisis, the migrant crisis, fears of what's perceived as an aggressive Russia next door. But I think Brexit could prove to be the biggest body blow of all, because first of all, in the UK, people are now looking at the financial markets. What does this mean for the pound? Well, hundreds of thousands of families across Europe today are worrying about the future of the euro. It had been nervously recovering. What now? Also, what is the future of the European Union? You had Eurosceptic leaders across the continent. I've been watching European politics for a very long time. I have never seen the mood so Eurosceptic. Those leaders in France, Italy, the Netherlands were queuing up to crow about Brexit and to call for a vote in their own country. Prime ministers across Europe are very, very aware of that. They're nervously looking over their shoulders at these Eurosceptic, more nationalist-minded leaders. But here, the mood amongst the leaders, you know, the Brussels bureaucrats, if you like, is please stay calm. We don't know where we're going to go. We heard very early this morning from Martin Schulz, the President of the European Parliament.
I think it will not lead to a breakup of the European Union. If we take serious one of the messages, there is an enormous gap, social gap between countries and within the society, and to fill that gap with more social justice and especially the fight for a better distribution of the wealth is what, for me, is one of the messages, especially for those voters who voted for leave because they feel uncomfortable with their individual social circumstances.
So that was the immediate reaction. Katja, how is it likely to work now in terms of negotiations, the sorts of trade deals? What can Britain expect? Because there was a fear that they would be punished to stop a domino effect happening through the rest of Europe.
Well, there's definitely a hardening of hearts, if you like. I mean, already this morning there's been talk of how the British Commissioner from the building there, he might like to leave his job. Plenty of British civil servants walking in here this morning worrying about what their future might be. But I think this is less about vindictiveness or punishing the UK per se. But again, as we spoke, this fear of contagion of people across Europe asking for their own referendum. There's a feeling here in Brussels and amongst European leaders that a deal with the UK, even though, yes, it is an attractive trade partner, can't be painless, can't be easy, can't be generous, because others have to be put off asking to leave the EU as well. So you will now have to hand over to the UK. The UK has to give formal notice, has to formally say it wants to leave the European Union. But already here, people are plotting, planning, discussing where it would go, how it would respond.
All right, Katja, for now, thanks very much. Sophie, I suppose like any divorce, it is messy. There are recriminations, there's anger before you ever get to the practicalities of sorting things out. Back to you.
Matthew, for now, thank you. Well, what has certainly been messy this morning is what's been going on in the city. Our business editor, Simon Jack, is there. He's been monitoring the markets. And in the aftermath of this result, I mean, the pound literally fell off a cliff. More than 120 billion wiped off the value of the markets. What is the situation now?
Well, Sophie, you're right. The first, if you like, frontier of this shockwave was in the financial markets. The pound had its steepest fall ever in the years since 1972, when it's been floating freely. You can see here at midnight last night, the city thought it was right. It had backed Remain, essentially. Got a nasty shock when that Sunderland result came through. And then as the results came in, the pound continued to fall. It was down 10% peak to trough at one point. To give you an idea, that is double, more than double the amount that the pound fell on Black Wednesday back in 1992. Now, Mark Carney came out to reassure financial markets and said the banks are going to be fine, we've got your back, we're looking after everyone. And so there was some comfort there. But then the question now, in a way, moves to the rest of the economy. How is this going to hit businesses? How are people's jobs going to be affected? Those people who import, those imports are going to get more expensive. On a morning about a messy divorce, I've got someone called Paul Marriage here who actually runs a small business, a small cap fund, which looks into the fortunes of smaller companies. So you're getting to your desk this morning. You own a small business. What's going through your mind?
Yeah, well, thanks, Simon. I think the thing you're looking at is continuity here. We're investing here in the companies of tomorrow. Anybody who runs a small business is hoping to be one of the big companies of tomorrow. They're going to be a big company of tomorrow today, if you know what I mean. So there's a good opportunity for them. Weak sterling is generally quite good for UK exporters. We are generally quite an export-led economy. There are going to be areas where companies have to make tough decisions. A weak consumer is going to have a negative impact on consumer-related companies. You mentioned imports there a little bit as well. So, it's a two-way pull overall. But I think for a lot of these companies, they'll be saying, well, it's business as normal. The sun came up this morning like it did yesterday, and they're going to be cracking on. We're a very dynamic economy, and I think a lot of the guys who run those businesses themselves are entrepreneurial people. We're pretty good at that as a country.
OK, so keep calm, carry on is your message there. Let's just have a quick look at the European stock markets. You were just in Brussels there, and I think a very interesting story here, because as you can see, actually the other stock markets around Europe, this is, for example, the French market down 7.5%, the Spanish market down 10%, the Italian market down 10%, actually down much more than the UK stock market, which shows that this is a big impact on the economic fortunes of the European Union. And Paul, I suppose this is a conversation that we're having in this country, which is potentially coming to these countries soon.
Yeah, I guess that all these countries are going to be looking and saying, I wonder what their populace really thinks of this result. And I guess those stock markets are suggesting there's going to be more political instability in the coming months. And hence we're seeing those big falls in Europe.
OK, so mutually non-beneficial is the answer we're getting from the city. When it comes to jobs, I should say that a lot of people, the chatter in the city is that some banks are saying they may need to move some of their staff to Europe to serve European clients. It depends on how the negotiations go. We've got weeks, months, even years ahead. But the chatter is in the city that some jobs currently in London may find their way to Europe. But that's the chat here. And as you can see, although the UK market has recovered a little bit, stock markets in Europe are a sea of red, and red means down.
Simon Jack in the city with the latest. Thank you very much. Well, of course, in America, still very early in the morning, no reaction yet from America itself. But Donald Trump, by chance, is in the United Kingdom today. He's arrived in Ayrshire at his golf course there, and he gave his reaction to the verdict a short time ago. Mr. Trump?
Well, I said this was going to happen, and I think that it's a great thing, and we will see, but I think it's going to be a great thing.
Any words for David Cameron?
Basically, they took back their country. That's a great thing.
And a great thing, an amazing vote, very historic. That's what Donald Trump has had to say this morning. Let's get some reaction now from the public. From Victoria, Derbyshire is in Manchester.
Right, Britain is out. Some of you voted to leave. What words would you use to describe how you're feeling right now?
Optimistic. Disappointed.
Disappointed. Optimistic, I heard?
Optimistic indeed.
You voted leave, did you?
I voted leave indeed, and two reasons mainly for optimistic is mainly because we can now negotiate our own free trade agreements with the rest of the world, but mainly working hard, hard-earning Brits can get a pay rise, and I think that's a big thing.
Okay.
I'm quite worried, Victoria. I voted to remain. I thought it would be better for jobs, for the economy. This campaign has been so divisive. Communities are against each other, neighbours are pitted against each other. If you look at Northern Ireland, London, Scotland, they've all voted to remain substantially. And I think now we need to unite. So we've voted, we've democratically made a decision.
How easy is it going to be to unite, do you think?
It's going to take a long time.
It's going to take a long time.
It's going to take a long time. I mean, there have been things said in this campaign. There have been some horrible things said about immigration, about Muslims, and you expect people just to forget that overnight. Okay, we can say we accept the result, we are leaving, but what about all the horrible things?
You voted to remain. In fact, you changed your mind. You were leave, weren't you?
I've always been leave, and I'm not devastated with leaving. I work with a lot of young Asian Muslims, and a lot of them wanted to leave because they think that immigration will be opened up to South Asia.
Okay.
I don't think immigration will stop just because of leaving.
You all agree that the country is divided. Mm-hmm. What is the way that we are going to bring people together, if you think that's the right thing to do?
I thought David Cameron will remain for some time to consolidate and also implement the changes
that needs to happen, but I'm disappointed that he's announced that he's resigning.
Okay, so he's not the man to do it. Who is the...
I don't think we are. We're all able to work together.
Yeah.
Don't think we are divided.
You don't?
I don't think so. We've had elections before.
We need to get on and get this job done now and work together and move forward. It was always on a knife edge. It could have gone either way. And those people that voted Remain need to accept that. I voted Remain. I accept it. I want to see the country moving forward now. And the one thing that the British public do not want is the media, the newspapers, using words like catastrophe, disaster. We need to be moving forward. Muster, the great British stiff upper lip and get on with it now. That's what we need to do.
I want to bring Suzanne in. Tom, if you want to hand the microphone over. Suzanne, you voted...
I voted to leave.
Yeah. And how are you feeling right now?
I'm feeling excited about the decision. I'm actually quite surprised that it went that way.
Are you?
I didn't
That's what Adam said earlier. He voted leave. He didn't expect there to be a vote to leave.
I didn't expect it, so that was a real surprise. I'm quite shocked that David Cameron is going to step down. I'm not the biggest Conservative supporter, but I think he's done a reasonable job with the economy at the moment. So I think as long as there's some stability that comes in, and I think the important thing at the moment is that they really bring in the people who wanted to remain. I think when they start talking about the leaving process itself,
okay, so who is the right? Who do we think is the right person? Who do you think is the right person to lead Britain out of the EU?
I think
a Labour government. Okay, what do you say, Paul?
I think there needs to be a cross-party plan put together from both sides, but far more people from the industrial world to come in and assist the government in making the decisions.
How realistic?
But
do we how realistic?
Well
a period of reflection, but how realistic do we think Paul's desire is that there will be a cross-party group of politicians?
It's going to be blue on blue attacks until October. We need to come together, we need to join together, we need to work together so Great Britain can be greater still, because this is tumultuous times in the economy. We've seen how the shares have gone.
I'm looking for names. Who is
Theresa
the right
May.
Theresa May?
Yeah, I think she's conducted herself very well during the campaign. I know she obviously sided with the government, which any good front bencher will do. However, I think she's sensible. I think she could do a good job.
Stuart, do you agree?
Not necessarily. I think the danger is whoever comes in, the problem is we get into this period where no decisions are made because everybody will sit on the fence till there is a change in the Conservative government, or whether that is a snap election, I don't know.
There's one person who put himself in a win-win position, and that's Boris Johnson. And he'll do it.
I believe George Osborne will do it because he's got knowledge of the economy. That's what I think.
I think that Theresa May has put herself in a perfect position because she stayed relatively out of the debate, and she's rose above it to kind of take sort of a statesman-style approach.
But she's a Remainer. You're saying she'd be the right person to lead Britain out of the EU?
I think she'd be quite good to lead a sort of coalition of groups.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. You need to bring in. You need to bring in the people who are on the Leave side and the Remain side. You need a combination of them in order to make those decisions, because that's how you'll bring the people who wanted to remain into the process.
Oh, well, that's interesting, yeah.
Andrea Ledden.
I think it's got to be someone who passionately believes in Brexit. That's where the country's voted for, so it's got to be someone who believes in it and drive us forward.
I'm going to pause you there. There's plenty more time later, but thank you for the moment. More from Manchester throughout the morning.
The UK has voted to leave the European Union in the most seismic decision in generations. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, has announced that he will step down by October. 52% of people who cast a ballot made the momentous decision to leave the EU. The Prime Minister gave an emotional address this morning explaining his decision.
I fought this campaign in the only way I know how, which is to say directly and passionately what I think and feel, head, heart and soul. I held nothing back. I was absolutely clear about my belief that Britain is stronger, safer and better off inside the European Union. And I made clear the referendum was about this and this alone, not the future of any single politician, including myself. But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
One man who could replace him, the victorious Vote Leave campaigner Boris Johnson, battles through a scrum of police, protesters and supporters as he leaves his house without comment. We expect to hear from him in the next hour. Leave campaigners are jubilant at the result, saying it sends a stinging message to the European Union's political elites. The pound has plunged on the result. The Governor of the Bank of England says he'll do what's necessary to support the financial markets.
Tory leadership speculations already mounting here in Westminster after David Cameron's announcement that he's going, but the repercussions have rocked the whole of the British establishment. I'm talking to leading politicians and commentators about what happens next, both on the UK political scene and for the future of the UK outside the EU and for the EU itself.
Here in Manchester, we will talk to voters about the momentous decision that some of them have made and the dramatic ramifications. There really is quite a sombre mood in here now after David Cameron's announcement, including from Leave voters. So we will ask about people's hopes and fears for the United Kingdom now.
Good morning from Downing Street. After more than 40 years, Britain has voted to end its membership of the European Union. The vote was decisive. 52% chose to leave the EU and 48% wanted to stay. David Cameron has announced that he is to step down as Prime Minister. Mr. Cameron, who argued strongly for the Remain campaign, said the will of the people must be respected and fresh leadership was required with a new Prime Minister by October. As the result became clear, more than £120 billion was wiped off the value of the financial markets when they opened this morning, and the pound plunged. Well, the final result shows that Leave secured its victory by a margin of more than 1 million votes. In total, 17.4 million people voted for the UK to leave the EU. That compares with the 16.1 million voters who backed Remain. More than 72% of eligible voters took part. In England, more than 15 million people voted for the UK to leave the EU. 13.2 million people backed Remain. In Scotland, every voting area came out in favour of Remain. 62% of Scottish voters backed Remain, with 38% backing a Leave vote. In Wales, Leave won over 52% of the vote and secured the most votes in all but 5 of the 22 counting areas. In Northern Ireland, the only part of the UK that shares a border with the EU, voters backed Remain, with 55% of voters choosing to remain in the EU and 45% voting to leave it. Well, that is how the results across the United Kingdom look this morning. We will be discussing throughout the morning in great detail what it all means for you, what it means for the United Kingdom, and also for the rest of the European Union. But first, our political correspondent Carol Walker has this report on the dramatic events so far.
There was no hiding the emotion as the Prime Minister and his wife Samantha emerged from Downing Street.
Good morning, everyone.
He said the will of the British people must be respected, but having fought and lost the battle to remain in the EU, the country should have a new Prime Minister.
I fought this campaign in the only way I know how, which is to say directly and passionately what I think and feel, head, heart and soul. I held nothing back. But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction. I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
With turmoil and uncertainty in the financial markets, the Governor of the Bank of England said it was prepared to take further action to support the British economy if necessary.
And we've taken all the necessary steps to prepare for today's events. And in the future, we will not hesitate to take any additional measures required to meet our responsibilities as the United Kingdom moves forward.
From the moment the results started coming in just after midnight, there were big wins for Leave. By the end of the night, Leave had won a clean sweep across the north of England, the Midlands, the east and west of England. London was the only region of England to support remaining a member of the EU. The result in Flintshire reflected the outcome across Wales, where voters backed Brexit. But Scotland voted by a clear majority to stay in the EU. Scotland's First Minister said it was clear that the people of Scotland see their future as part of the European Union. The results will bring fresh calls for a second referendum on Scottish independence. Northern Ireland, too, has voted to remain in the EU. Sinn Féin has said it intensifies the case for a vote on whether Northern Ireland should leave the United Kingdom. Shortly before 5 o'clock this morning, it was clear the UK had taken the historic decision to leave the European Union.
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU.
UKIP's leader, Nigel Farage, said he was thrilled that the country had decided to break free from what he called a failing, dying European Union.
17 million people have said we must leave the European Union. We now need a Brexit government. A government that gets on with the job. A government that begins the renegotiation of our trade relationship.
The Labour leader said he hoped the negotiations with the European Union would include efforts to protect British workers.
Clearly, there are some very difficult days ahead. The value of the pound has already fallen, and there will therefore be job consequences as a result of this decision.
Thank you very much.
A momentous day for Britain, for Europe, as the country embarks on a new and uncertain future, outside the EU and under a different leader. Carol Walker, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, in a moment, we'll be going to the city and our business editor, Simon Jack, who is monitoring events there. But with me now is our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. And we saw earlier from the reaction outside Boris Johnson's house as he left, boos and cheers, a divided nation. But you have got to think of all the millions and millions of people who are jubilant because finally they have got what they wanted. We're leaving the EU.
For some, obviously, dejection. For others, utter joy. I was speaking to one leading Brexit campaigner who compared it to the Reformation. His view was this was a chance for Britain to be reborn, unconstrained by continental Europe, and there would be a modern equivalent of the Elizabethan age with a flowering of British culture, self-confidence and power. And for them it has been an extraordinarily long, persistent, attritional campaign. But it is, yes, a very divided country, both geographically. We have London and Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in, everywhere else pretty much to get out. Also in terms of class and culture, you look at sort of some of the more affluent, prosperous cities where there are graduates, they tended to vote in. But large swathes of Britain where they've suffered through the decline of older industries, where they haven't really seen any rebirth in their communities, and they, I think, have felt a grievance that while down in places like London things seem to be going pretty well, they weren't able to walk on the sunny side of the street. And that is most marked in the traditional Labour areas, where despite the pleas of the Labour leadership, huge numbers of Labour voters voted to quit. In Hartlepool, 70%, in Corby, 64%. Massive majorities to leave. And I think that tells its own story about this sort of two-nation Britain that has been thrown up by this referendum.
Seismic changes ahead, not least here at number 10.
And events are moving so fast, Sophie. I mean, Mr. Cameron has announced he is standing down. He says he will remain until the party conference in October. He is, in effect, just a caretaker Prime Minister at the moment. The leadership contest will begin now. I understand some of the likely players are already considering their options. It has to begin now just because of the mechanics of the leadership contest, because the party membership have to choose eventually between two candidates. That'll take about a month's worth of ballot papers being sent out, so that brings you back to the end of August. The MPs will have to choose who those two are. Well, Parliament goes into recess in July, so they have to decide now. So that leadership process will begin now. Boris Johnson very obviously in pole position. Without him, I doubt the Brexit campaign would have anything like the impetus, momentum, may not even have won without him. Let me just say on the Labour side too, there are growing rumblings that now has come the time to move against Jeremy Corbyn, and I think you will find Labour figures later this morning calling publicly for Jeremy Corbyn to consider his position because of the lacklustre campaign he fought. He went through this campaign saying he wasn't much of a fan of the EU.
7.5 out of 10.
They blame him for failing to galvanise the Labour vote. So, you know, we could end up with a situation where David Cameron is gone, where Jeremy Corbyn is gone. You could almost end up with a reshaping of politics at Westminster. And in the back of all that, who knows, we may even have a general election sooner rather than later. All change.
All change. Who knows? Indeed. Norman Smith, thank you. Well, as the result became clear in the early hours of this morning, the pound plunged. It literally fell off the cliff. Let's go to the city now, to our business editor, Simon Jack, who is there. Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, has been seeking to reassure markets. What is the situation there now? Because this was not what they were expecting, Simon, was it?
No, there was a nagging question, Sophie, going into this referendum. Who was right? Was it the bookies and the city, or was it the polls? Because the polls had this on a knife edge, and yet the city was making bets that Remain was in the bag. If you look at this chart, this is where the pound was. It was worth $1.50, its highest of 2016. And because it was a shock, it got an almighty reckoning in the small hours of the morning, falling 10% peak to trough. Now, to give you some idea, that is more than double the amount the pound fell on Black Wednesday back in 1992. So they were looking for some reassurance. Out comes Mark Carney. He says, don't worry, everyone, I've got your back. The Bank of England stands ready to put in £250 billion of extra liquidity into the system. And that seemed to work. And as you can see, it's been making some headway here. It went on the effect was translated into the stock market, which fell 500 points when we opened. And not only that, it's not just here in the UK, but it's around Europe. Let me show you what the European stock markets are doing. You can see here in Spain, down 10%. In Italy, down 10% as well. In fact, down twice as much as the FTSE here in the UK. So you're seeing that a lot of investors are saying this could be as bad, if not worse, for some of the European economies. Other business leaders have come out and saying, look, we respect the opinion of the British people, but people like JP Morgan here in the city saying, look, we might have to move some people. If we have to be near our European clients and be inside the European Union to do that, we may have to move people around. So a lot of nervousness. We had a lot of shock this morning, and now some questions being asked about the future. Now, bear in mind, no one's going to lose their job today. We've got months, days, weeks, even years to negotiate the finer points of how exactly we're going to deal with the rest of the world. But the shockwaves are being felt here in the city, and the reverberations will begin to trickle through to the real economy. In what ways, it's just too early to say.
Simon Jack, our business editor in the city for now. Thank you. Well, politicians, of course, are continuing to react this morning to the referendum result and to the resignation of David Cameron, who says he will be stepping down by October. For some, Britain's exit from the EU is something they have been campaigning for their whole political lives. For others, it's something they never wanted to see, and this morning's news has come as a profound shock. The UKIP leader Nigel Farage said the referendum was won because of large numbers of Labour supporters who voted against the party leadership, who were campaigning for a Remain vote. Well, let's go now to College Green here in Westminster, and Andrew Neil. Andrew.
Thanks, Sophie. I'm joined here by John Mann MP, one of a small number of Labour MPs who campaigned to leave, and by Douglas Carswell, UKIP's only MP. Welcome to you both. John Mann, the Prime Minister's now fallen on his sword. Should Jeremy Corbyn follow his example?
No, I think no, not in the short term. Jeremy should be talking to Labour voters, but also coming up with an agenda of what should happen, because it's Labour voters who won this referendum. And that creates a mandate for the new Tory leader. And that mandate is not to renege on any of the workers' rights issues, the paid holidays, the maternity pay, the working hours, but also one of the quick wins can be to reverse the privatisation of the NHS, which EU procurement rules has allowed in my area. That's what Jeremy ought to be on the front foot from now on demanding. It's certainly what I'm demanding of whoever the new Tory leader is, and there is a mandate there from this extraordinary referendum for that.
I'm told that there's a letter signed by 55 Labour MPs calling for Mr Corbyn to go. It's going to be delivered next week. Have you seen that? Have you signed it?
I haven't seen it.
No?
So
Would you sign it if you saw it?
I think that's a bit of a distraction.
Yeah.
Because the big issue is what the agenda should be. That's what's critical now. And, you know, one of the problems with the Labour Party, we spend too much time looking at who does the job. That's important. We did it after the election defeat in 2015. Not enough time thinking through the lessons to be learned. Our voters have voted the way that I thought they should vote, and they voted in very large numbers. Not every Labour MP fully understands that.
Well, let me ask you about that. Why does Labour now no longer represent the non-metropolitan working classes?
Right, Labour has failed to listen, and it's not had the courage to talk about immigration. So that is the big issue. People haven't been prepared to talk about. I still get tweets in the last few hours, you know, you racist, this, etc. I mean, total nonsense. I'm not a racist, I'm a very active anti-racist, and neither are my constituents who voted to leave. And it's rather condescending and patronising to suggest they are. Labour needs to get its head round the immigration argument.
Can that happen with Mr Corbyn? He said explicitly that he doesn't think there should be any upper limit on immigration.
Well, that's why Mr Corbyn needs to spend a good amount of time with my Labour voters and others in the north of England, understanding their aspirations, their views, their perspective.
Douglas Carswell, what happens now to UKIP? Haven't you lost your reason for existing?
Well, I think that so much of politics, as this referendum has shown, is a cartel. Many people who voted will feel that the party they normally vote for is led by people who have more in common with one another here in Westminster than they do with those they're supposed to represent. We need change to break that cartel. I'm hoping that UKIP can be the change. But, you know, if you want to be the change, you've got to be optimistic, forward-looking. You can't do nativism.
But you've won the referendum. We have voted to leave, which was the primary purpose of UKIP. The Tories will now probably pick a Brexit leader, someone who was in favour of coming out. What's UKIP's appeal to wavering Tories?
Well, I think it's actually let down Labour that is the big potential growth market for UKIP.
So not the Tories?
Well, there are some Conservatives who could still come to UKIP, but I think we've sort of slightly maxed out that market. I think the big growth market, you know, the party...
You only got one MP, it's you.
The party of Keir Hardie is now the party in favour of giving technocrats and bankers in Brussels and in Europe control over people's lives. This is not the party that Keir Hardie founded. Our opportunity comes in going into that and competing for those votes.
Hang on a minute.
You tell them about the Labour Party.
You know, my family was part of founding the Labour Party as engineering workers, and has been it all the way through. And you know, the Heartland voters are Labour voters, and you know, frankly, splitting and dividing and letting the Tory elite continue ruling does nothing for them.
But do you take the point that the Tories...
We need to use the term reconnect with those voters, but that means actually changing some of our policies to meet their aspirations, and that's what we've not done sufficiently.
If you don't, is UKIP now more of a threat to Labour in the north than to the Tories in the south?
The next election, the threat to us is the Tory party. Never underestimate the Tory party recreating itself for power, and this gives us an opportunity. This mandate for change is a mandate against privatisation, and it is a mandate for pay, for conditions, for workers' rights.
Can I make a suggestion that the party that I think is going to be most successful in appealing to this new disaffected electorate is going to be the party that actually practices a bit of open source democracy itself. Instead of a small elite in Westminster choosing the candidates, let's use open primaries to do it. Instead of a small elite deciding policy, let's let members decide it. If parties want to appeal to people who are disaffected by the cartel, they need to break the cartel by fundamentally changing what it means to be a party.
A more immediate question. Should Labour, or Her Majesty's opposition, be involved in the Brexit talks?
Yes. The government should allow them to be. The new Tory leader, Prime Minister, should have it cross-party, particularly with Labour involved. And yes, in my view, Labour should be, because we should be getting the best terms, and the Labour voice should be heard in that.
And UKIP, yes or no?
We need consensus. A huge minority voted to remain. We need to respect their views and take them into account.
Is it a yes?
I would love to be involved, but
Very well. I'll take it as a yes. We'll leave it there. Thank you both. Let's go straight to Victoria now in Manchester.
Thank you, Andrew. We have got Anna here with 6-month-old Erin. Anna, your little girl is going to grow up in an independent Great Britain. What do you think of that?
I felt absolutely devastated this morning.
Did you?
Knowing that my daughter's going to be growing up in a very inward-looking country, one that I'm quite scared about living in at the moment because it feels like there's so much hate being bred by the media and by certain political parties.
And why?
I just want Erin to have the ability to sort of learn about other cultures and be part of a Europe that I see as a really positive thing for her and for other children in this country.
But leaving the European Union doesn't mean she won't be able to do that, to look outward towards Europe, to look to the rest of the world.
I think it's the political climate and the attitude of others, though, that will influence her and other children, which I'm worried about.
All right. And we've got Francesca here, 24-year-old Francesca, also from Manchester, like Anna and Erin. You voted to remain.
Yeah.
What are you thinking right now?
I didn't think I would be here. Last night when I went to bed, I thought this isn't going to be something that's going to affect me. I thought it'd be quite similar to the Scottish referendum, you know, where nothing changed. But
you thought Remain was going to win?
Yeah, definitely.
So what are you thinking?
It's just the unknown now, and I think particularly for the younger voters, when we see sort of Nigel Farage claiming things like the NHS money going directly to them and then going back on those kinds of things, it's just like when the Lib Dems said, you know, student fees will be eliminated, and I think young people in politics just don't trust politicians anymore, and I think this is just another example of that.
What do you think about your future?
Question mark. You know?
Really?
Yeah. I just
I
think
wonder, I don't want to generalise too much, but do we have a small microcosm here? We have Anna, who's 32, Francesca, who's 24, who both voted Remain. Keith, I'm not going to ask your age.
I'm a very young 64, Victoria.
You're 64 and you're very welcome, and you voted to leave.
Yes.
Briefly, why?
Well, fundamentally for me, it was about democracy. And I can't actually believe, I'm surprised really that we did win, because I can't believe the mass ranks of ordinary people felt confident enough to vote against the mass ranks of the establishment.
Right. What about the 48% of people who also voted Remain?
Well, that's,
they're not the establishment.
if it was the other way around, it would be the same, wouldn't it? And, you know, that's democracy, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's nothing more democratic than this vote, is there? Some of the elections of constituencies, they're all rigged, really, aren't they? But
you may say that.
Well, I mean, they're set up that you know what the outcome is going to be before the result comes through.
Whereas on
with
this
you did not know,
counted,
and one man, one vote counts equal. And, you know, we got 52%. If we got 48, I would have accepted that.
OK. And one woman, one vote as
well.
well.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Keith, and Anna and Francesca for
Be hopeful, be hopeful. People have come together today from both sides.
OK.
Good conversation. There's no reason why that can't transfer across the country.
Fair enough. Thank you. More from Manchester later.
Victoria, thank you very much. Well, this result, of course, will have huge implications right across the UK. Let's get reaction now from Scotland, from Wales and from Northern Ireland and find out what the consequences of the vote could prove to be. Gavin Esler is in Edinburgh, Thomas Morgan is in Cardiff and Chris Buckler is in Belfast. Gavin, let's start with you.
Yes, hello from Edinburgh, which is a city which has always seen itself as a great European capital. So it's no surprise to anyone that the city, which is sometimes called the Athens of the North, some 75% of the voters should have voted to remain within the EU. 62% of Scots across the country want to stay within the EU, which raises a big question, of course. If the people of Scotland want to remain in the EU and the people of England want to get out of the EU, is it time for Scotland to break away from England? And that is the big subject of discussion here in Edinburgh. Within the next hour, probably just after 11 o'clock, we expect the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, to perhaps reopen the case for a second referendum. It's quite a complicated procedure. It's called Section 30 of the Scotland Act. It would require negotiations with Westminster, but that is exactly what the SNP faithful would like her to do. So David Cameron's legacy could be that as Prime Minister, he is seeing not only Britain leaving the EU, but also the end of the United Kingdom.
And in Wales, 17 of the 22 local authorities here voted out. And I think it's fair to say that the Remain camp weren't expecting such a strong showing for a Brexit here. It was 52.5%, a 5% gap between them and the Remain campaign. Now, the turnout in Wales was 72%. That is significantly higher than the Welsh Assembly elections last month, where there was only 45% that turned out to vote back then. And the majority of those areas that voted to leave here are actually areas that really benefit from EU funding, areas in the valleys like Blaenau Gwent, Torfaen and Caerphilly. Now, reacting to the news this morning, Carwyn Jones, the First Minister of Wales, gave a statement and he said, now that Wales and Britain have left the EU, the way that Wales is funded will have to be renegotiated.
If Wales is a net beneficiary from the EU to the tune of hundreds of millions of pounds, there is now an overwhelming case for a major and immediate revision of the Barnett formula, taking into account needs arising from EU withdrawal. And I will be making the call both today and in the days to come for the promise that was made to Wales that Wales would not lose a penny as a result of the result last night. I will be calling for that promise to be honoured. Sixthly and finally, withdrawal from the EU is a massive constitutional shift for the UK. It has equally far-ranging implications for the devolution settlement. The relationship between devolved administrations and the UK government must now be placed onto an entirely different footing.
Carwyn Jones, the First Minister of Wales. Now, some have said that the Remain camp here in Wales were too slow to react after last month's Welsh Assembly when 7 UKIP members were elected here in the Senedd in Cardiff Bay. The Labour vote was down by 7%, and as I say, some have said that they were just too slow and didn't realise that there was such a strong vote for a Brexit here. Neil Hamilton, the leader for UKIP in Wales, has been said he's delighted, if not slightly surprised, with today's result.
Well, here in Northern Ireland, there was a vote to Remain. However, truthfully, when you look at the figures, 56% for Remain and 44% for Leave, I think some Remain campaigners will be disappointed that they didn't get more of their vote out. And when you take a look at the figures and break them down constituency to constituency, what it does seem to show is that nationalists did not get engaged and they were far more likely to vote Remain. On the other hand, unionists did get their vote out and they were more likely to vote for Leave. In fact, the Democratic Unionist Party were one of the most vocal of the Leave campaigners, the biggest party, of course, at Stormont. And today they have welcomed that vote across the UK for a vote to leave the EU. But that does have major complications here and major implications. First of all, there's the question of the economy. There's a lot of cross-border trade between here and the Republic of Ireland. Also, a big trading partner with the rest of the UK, the Republic. As a result, there are questions about what will happen to that. And there are questions about what will happen to that border that exists currently. Lots of talk during the campaign about whether there would have to be customs checkpoints or perhaps checks between the islands if that was going forward. On top of that, there are also questions about whether there should be some kind of independence referendum here. Not in terms of complete independence, but rather of a united Ireland. A border poll has been called for by Sinn Féin. That's been ruled out by the DUP this morning, but it has started a debate. And these questions about the EU have now also raised a lot of questions about the UK.
Chris Butler in Belfast, Thomas Mason in Cardiff, Thomas Morgan in Cardiff, apologies, and Gavin Esler in Edinburgh. Thank you all very much. Well, this is BBC News. It's very nearly 10:30. You are watching a special EU referendum programme with me, Sophie Rayworth. We can now go over to the BBC newsroom for a summary of all the latest news with Joanna Gosling.
After more than 40 years, the UK is to end its membership of the European Union. The decision has been decisive, with the Leave campaign securing its victory by a margin of more than 1 million votes. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, has said he will step down, and a new Prime Minister will be in place within months. In total, 17.4 million people voted for the UK to leave the EU. That compares with the 16.1 million voters who backed Remain. Turnout was 72%, which was the highest level in a nationwide ballot in the UK since 1992. As the UK woke up to the news it is to exit the European Union, Leave campaigners began celebrating. UKIP's leader Nigel Farage led those in Westminster, saying June the 23rd should now be regarded as Britain's Independence Day. Those from the Remain camp described the result as a catastrophe. Supporters of Remain consoled each other as the campaign received lower than expected support across swathes of England, including the Midlands and the North. Speaking outside Downing Street, David Cameron said he will resign as Prime Minister with a new leader appointed by October.
I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction. I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination. This is not a decision I've taken lightly, but I do believe it's in the national interest to have a period of stability and then the new leadership required. There is no need for a precise timetable today, but in my view we should aim to have a new Prime Minister in place by the start of the Conservative Party conference in October.
The former London mayor and leading Brexit campaigner Boris Johnson, who has been a prominent figure in the Vote Leave campaign, was met with boos from demonstrators as he left his North London home a short while ago. He scored a major victory and is now a leading candidate to succeed David Cameron as Prime Minister. He battled his way through a scrum of police and protesters to boos and cheers without comment. The results have upset the world's financial markets. The pound plunged. It's the biggest one-day drop in 30 years. It fell to levels not seen since 1985. The governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who had previously warned of the dangers of a vote to leave the EU, sought to reassure financial markets. He said the bank was well prepared for a leave vote.
We've taken all the necessary steps to prepare for today's events, and in the future, we will not hesitate to take any additional measures required to meet our responsibilities as the United Kingdom moves forward.
Well, let's go back now to Sophie Roworth in Downing Street. Sophie.
Joanna, thank you very much. So, big questions about what this decision will now mean for the United Kingdom. Big questions, too, about what it will mean for the future of the European Union and for its 27 other member states. The European Parliament has held an emergency meeting this morning in response to the referendum result. Matthew Amroliwala is in Brussels for us now. Matthew.
Sophie, thanks very much. They are absolutely stunned here at the heart of the EU. Earlier in the day, the Council President Donald Tusk was saying this is not the time for hysterical reaction. He may say that, but this is a seismic decision, not just for Britain, but for the EU as a whole itself. Let's gauge the mood around European capitals. We have Jenny Hill in Berlin, Hugh Schofield is in Paris for us, and Kasia Madeira is in Warsaw. Jenny, to you first of all, the reaction from there, how difficult is this exit going to be?
Well, I've spent the morning here in the German Parliament, and I can tell you that the sense of shock and disbelief is really very striking. I think even at the very highest level here in Germany, nobody really expected this. But you know, we're already getting the sense from politicians here that they're not going to make it easy for Britain to negotiate some kind of new relationship with the EU. Already 3 MPs have said to me separately, Britain can't expect to cherry pick when it renegotiates its relationship. There must be consequences for this decision, and there will be no special treatment. Out means out. Don't underestimate the sense of sadness there is here too. I think the Vice-Chancellor Sigmar Gabriel spoke for many when he tweeted first thing this morning, damn, this is a bad day for Europe. But the reason that MPs are starting to talk in such tough terms is because they are really concerned that this could precipitate fallout within Europe, potentially the erosion, even the breakup of the European Union. So they're very keen to discourage any other countries following Britain to the door. Of course, they're going to face a lot of lobbying from industry here in Germany. There are huge commercial ties, of course, between Germany and Britain. For now, though, there is very much a profound sense of shock. We're waiting to hear from Angela Merkel in the next couple of hours, but many MPs have said this morning this is a sad day for Britain, for Germany and for Europe. For the view from France now, let me hand you to Hugh Schofield, who's in Paris.
Yes, where President Francois Hollande must have been one of many leaders in Europe who got up this morning feeling that the world had somewhat shifted on its axis after the seismic vote in Britain. The president has had a pretty torrid time of it of late with various other matters on his agenda. This is even more terrible news for him, and he will be doing all he can to react to it. He's holding his a meeting now with his inner cabinet. Up till now, the whole process of Europe has been one of integration. The watchword in the article of faith almost here in France has been European integration. Now that this prospect has emerged of the very opposite of integration, disintegration, and that is preoccupying him greatly. So he's meeting now with his inner cabinet, and he will come out quite soon to give some kind of statement. I think we can more or less work out what he's going to say. He's going to say that he and other European leaders take note of the British decision. It is a democratic decision. And that therefore he wants the process of separation to take place very quickly indeed. I think there'll be very little patience here at all for any kind of delay in invoking Article 50. And he'll be very clear too that there will be no favours given to the Britain, no kind of halfway house in the British separation. But for the rest, he will talk about the EU and the need for a new leap forward and the need for, as Jenny was saying, no more contagion, because the great fear here is, of course, Le Pen's party in the National Front taking advantage of this to push its agenda. Now I must hand you over to Warsaw and Kasia Madeira.
Well, I can say that sense of shock here in Poland is absolutely echoed. The Foreign Minister Witold Waszczykowski said that this is bad news for Europe and bad news for Poland. Let's not forget that Poland has around 1 million or so of its nationals living and working in the UK. What is going to happen to all of these people? Their future is uncertain, and their future is of deep concern here for the government here in this country, because they send back around $1 billion a year, so a sizable chunk of money. Now, will they need visas? Will they need travel permits? Will they need work permits? This is all for discussions for the future, but it's this sense of sadness and also a sense of loss. I've been speaking to some students, one who is going off to Oxford University, who says that she feels unwanted. She feels unwanted by the UK, and her future is so bright. So a real sense of loss, and also a political loss for the Polish government here, because of course their ally, the British Conservative Party, was a huge political force in the European Conservatives and Reformists. So it's a day of shock at the moment. I think Poles here are just coming to grips after yesterday, when Polish politicians from both parties, from all the parties, governing and opposition, were saying hold your fingers, which means basically keeps your fingers crossed for the UK. So now I guess it's a matter of how Poland will agree some kind of agreements with the United Kingdom. How will Brussels deal with it? Which leads me back to you, Matthew.
All right, Kasia, Hugh and Jenny, thanks to all of you. I mentioned Donald Tusk a few moments ago. He is due to have a news conference within the next half hour with Jean-Claude Juncker. Mr Juncker earlier in the week saying he wouldn't resign if in effect he'd overseen a Brexit vote. So both of those will speak in the next half hour. I'm not sure they ever really had real contingency plans. They better get some. Sophie, back to you.
Matthew, thank you. Well, while there is shock across large parts of Europe, celebrations here. Millions of people who voted to leave can't believe that they have finally got what they wanted for so long. UKIP's Nigel Farage, we've already heard from him this morning. He's called it Independence Day for the UK, and he's tweeted a short time ago that he had kippers and champagne for breakfast. The people we haven't heard from yet, though, are the key figures of the Leave campaign: Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and Labour's Gisela Stewart. They are all expected to appear together at around 11 o'clock this morning. And we are also expecting to hear as well from Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, all around 11 o'clock this morning. We will, of course, bring you that live as soon as it happens. In the meantime, let's give you a proper breakdown of how the United Kingdom voted yesterday. Over to the BBC Newsroom now, and Christian Fraser.
Thank you, Sophie. Good morning, everyone. Yes, let's have a look at those numbers then in a little more detail. All the results in. We'll start with a look at England, shall we? Over 28 million people voted on Thursday. You can see that there was a pretty high turnout. In fact, the biggest turnout since 1992. They were saying that a big turnout would be good for Remain, but the bookies, the city, the pollsters, they all got it wrong. 6% lead for Leave in England. And just look at that huge slug of blue through the country there in the rural parts of Britain, in Cornwall, Devon, Dorset, right through into Lancashire and Yorkshire, into big Labour supporting areas. And these little maroon spots of yellow here, the metropolitan areas, so Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, York and Harrogate, more affluent areas of course, and then Newcastle up here. But Newcastle only by the slimmest of margins, and I think when you look at the map, it's those areas that they expected to win in, places like Durham, Sheffield, Coventry, Watford, where they just didn't get the vote out Remain and where they were losers on the night. Of course, London we expected to be Remain, nearly all of London in the Remain camp, but not all of the South East. Large parts of Kent there in blue. In fact, I think I can show you the top 5 areas that supported Leave. You'll see that 2 places in Lincolnshire are top of the pile. There you go, Boston and South Holland, well over 70% there. Castle Point in Essex, Thurrock and Great Yarmouth we know as big UKIP areas. And I'll just show you the top 5 Remain. No surprise there at the top, Gibraltar, of course, next to Spain, 96%, almost universal in Gibraltar. But then also the London boroughs, Lambeth, Hackney, Haringey and Foyle in Northern Ireland, which we'll talk about in a second. But let's take a closer look at Scotland. 32 regions in Scotland, every one of them going to Remain. But the interesting thing was the turnout. 2.7 million people voted in Scotland. The turnout was 67%, which was less than the UK average, 85% in the independence referendum, so much lower. Maybe some voter fatigue, 4 elections, of course, in under 2 years in Scotland. But the result, as we've been hearing from Gavin in Edinburgh, overwhelming, 62% to 38% for Leave. And of course, that opens up that question of a second independence referendum vote in Scotland. Similar picture in Northern Ireland, and an interesting picture as well. The vote perhaps split along some sectarian lines here. So 3 areas of Belfast out of 4 voting for Remain, but it's these areas close to the border, look, all in yellow. The turnout, again, lower than the UK average, 790,000. But let's take a final look at Wales, because this will be a huge disappointment to Labour and to Jeremy Corbyn. Only 5 of the 22 areas in Wales going to Remain. So Cardiff, yes, went to Remain, but Swansea didn't. And also some key areas like Merthyr Tydfil, Newport, Caerphilly, all going towards Leave. Again, turnout very high in Wales, and a similar picture when it's rounded up, 6-point lead for Leave over Remain. All those figures, incidentally, are on the website, so if you want to have a look at the website, do take a look, bbc.co.uk/news.
Christian Fraser, thank you very much. Well, a short time ago, the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, gave his reaction to the referendum result, and he said that he felt personally sorry for David Cameron. This is what he had to say.
We are a divided country, which is why it's important for the Prime Minister and for others to try and bring the country together and work out a way through this. And I don't think we should take any rash decisions at the moment. In the next days and weeks, we've got to see what the fallout is. We've got to handle that in a mature and sensible way. I think the Prime Minister is absolutely right not to invoke the Article 50 process at this point in time. We've got to reflect, we've got to unite, and then we've got to chart a way forward that's in the interest of the country, because we are dealing with massive questions. I mean, these are questions of fundamental importance to our future, economically, in our security, in our politics.
Tony Blair speaking there this morning. Well, political reaction continues to filter through both to Britain's historic decision to leave the EU and to the Prime Minister's resignation. Let's go to College Green at Westminster and Andrew Neil.
Thanks, Sophie. I've got 3 backbenchers here. Graham Brady, Conservative MP. He's a sort of shop steward for Tory backbenchers. Yvette Cooper, Labour MP, former Minister, and Owen Paterson, Tory MP, who campaigned for Leave. Graham Brady, we voted to leave the European Union. The governing party now has a leadership contest. Aren't we in for a summer of huge uncertainty?
Well, I think the Prime Minister did 2 important things this morning, alongside what was a pretty unexpected announcement that he will be going in a short timescale. The first was that he made it clear that he's not going immediately, so we have that period of continuity at least running up to the autumn, and I think that's crucial in settling the markets and calming people down. The other really important thing that he did was make it clear that he won't be invoking Article 50, this 2-year mechanism for negotiating exit from the EU. It means that we have the opportunity to have a calm, rational discussion about what our negotiating priorities are and how we should carry that out.
When does you play a pivotal role in this? When does the Tory leadership contest begin?
I will need to discuss that with the 1922 Committee Executive. We'll be meeting on Monday to have that conversation. Obviously, if we were to meet the timetable of a new leader in place before the party conference, we would need to be moving really quite quickly.
Yvette Cooper, does the Labour leadership have questions to answer about its conduct of the campaign?
I think there are some very difficult questions for the Labour Party. Look, we are in some very difficult waters now, very dangerous waters, and whether that's about the market stability, about the negotiations, and we have got a responsibility now to get the best deal for the country and to show some leadership working with the government in order to do so. I think that includes not calling for the immediate triggering of Article 50, as we seemed to be earlier this morning.
Mr. Corbyn, I understand, has called for the immediate
I don't think that is the right thing to do. I don't think that would be in the interests of the British people. I mean, obviously I'm very disappointed by the result, but we have to respect it and get the best possible deal for Britain and for Labour communities across Britain, which otherwise will be very vulnerable if we don't do that. And that's our responsibility now.
On the conduct of the campaign, why does Labour no longer represent the aspirations of the non-metropolitan working classes?
Right, there's been a big gap between the cities and the towns, the industrial towns, the coalfields. And I think we have to recognise that the Labour Party did not, I think, reflect people's concerns about immigration. I don't think the government had practical responses to people's concerns about immigration. There is now a big divide in the country around immigration, and we've got to try and build a new, sensible consensus around that. It's not an easy thing to do, but I think we have a responsibility to do that. Otherwise, regardless of the trade negotiations and so on, we will have a longer-term problems for the country.
Owen Paterson, who would you like to see as the next leader of the Conservative Party?
Well, let's see who puts their hat in the ring.
Well, who would you like to put their hat in the ring?
I'm not going to name a candidate at the moment. Let's just see who wants to put... We only heard about this incoming
you tried to tell me you've not been thinking about it.
No, I haven't really, no. I've been concentrating on winning the vote last night, which I'm absolutely delighted we succeeded in doing.
Is it not the case that Boris Johnson, given that he went effectively to head up the Leave campaign, is pretty unstoppable?
He'll have a strong case, obviously, and have a lot of support, but so will others. So let's, honestly, I think we're jumping the gun a bit. Let's see who puts their name in the hat.
Well, it's underway. You know politics as well as I do. The moment a Prime Minister says that he's resigning, the leadership campaign begins.
Yeah, and I watched the same statement by the Prime Minister as you did, and I was as surprised as you were, probably.
Were you surprised? Surely it was inevitable he would resign.
No, not necessarily, no. I mean, I didn't actually sign the letter that was going around, but I thought that he was elected on a platform last year of delivering a referendum, which meant that if there was a Leave vote or a Remain vote, he stayed as Prime Minister. Anyway, where we are, there's going to be a contest. Yeah. I think the important thing now, and I think Yvette's quite right, is that we've got a clear statement that we will not precipitately trigger Article 50, which is a good thing. And I think
that's to get us out, that's to begin the negotiations.
Under the Treaty of Lisbon, there's a formal 2-year period if a member state wants to secede from the European Union. And you should do that, if you decide to do that, once you've got the broad outlines of an agreement. And I think actually what we've now got is a period when we can sit down and work out exactly what those broad outlines are. Part of which is the issue Yvette raised, which is immigration. I mean, yesterday I was outside polling stations. Time and again, this issue was raised because we have got probably the first major economic rebound where a lot of people have not seen any remuneration increase because of this extraordinary influx. And we have trades like horticultural trade, which badly needs skilled workers. You have
Let me just interrupt you, just to tell our viewers that David Cameron has gone to Buckingham Palace to have an audience with the Queen. He did say this morning when he announced that he was resigning that he had already spoken to the Queen, actually. So it may have come as a surprise to you, but it didn't come as a surprise to Her Majesty. I suppose few things do these days. Tell me about the leadership contest. You've got to be a Tory MP to stand. Yes. And a number will throw their hats into the ring, and the Tory MPs have first go. They whittle it down to 2.
That's right. The rules require that we provide a choice of candidates for the party in the country. In the past, that has always been interpreted as 2. I can't see any reason why we would be likely to change that, but it'll be a decision for the 1922 executive, then in consultation with the board of the party. But that is the fundamental.
And do you expect Theresa May, the Home Secretary, to come out of her safe house in time for this leadership contest?
I'm sure the Home Secretary will be very much in evidence.
Well, she hasn't been during this campaign, has she?
I think she's made some cautious interventions from time to time.
Limited and cautious, I think, would be fair to
Which
say.
may have been wise.
The Prime Minister's fallen on his sword. Should Mr Corbyn fall on his sword?
Well, you're right that David Cameron has taken responsibility for a campaign which I think also didn't offer a positive vision. That was the other problem with the campaign the Prime Minister ran. But I think the challenge for now is for the country. In terms of the Labour Party and the questions that have to be asked in the Labour Party, the next step is the Shadow Cabinet is meeting, I think, as we speak. And I think it's for them now to set out, well, what kind of leadership are we going to be providing in terms of unifying the country, in terms of addressing the problems and the concerns for Labour voters in the towns and the coalfields that did not support the Labour Party's and the Labour leadership position, but also how are we going to now work with the government to get the best deal for the country
Would you
and
like
make sure
Labour to be on the negotiating committee?
Well, I think the whole party is going to have to work with the government on this, and also with our trade unions across the country, and with as many voices as possible.
I thank all 3 of you. We'll leave it there. The sun is out. Not sure what that means, but it is. But then I guess it is June. Let's go back to Sophie in Downing Street.
Andrew, thank you very much. Well, I think we can show you now shots of Buckingham Palace, because as we know, the Prime Minister left Downing Street about 45 minutes ago now, out through a back door, and he is now at Buckingham Palace, where he is having an audience with the Queen following his decision that he will step down as Prime Minister by October. A decision that many didn't think would come quite as early as today, but an emotional moment, emotional scenes for the Prime Minister and his wife here in Downing Street when that was announced, when he made that announcement at about 8:15 this morning. And now he is meeting with the Queen to inform her of his decision. Well, we can go now to the city, because there has been plenty of turmoil in the city this morning. The bankers, the traders, many of them, thousands of them, who have been up all night, many of them had bet on a Remain vote. It was wrong, and as a result, the pound plunged in the early hours of this morning. The markets too. Steph McGovern is at the Bank of England for us now. And what is the situation now? Is it rallying?
Good morning to you. Yeah, I think since we heard the Governor, Mark Carney, speak earlier, he was trying to reassure markets. They've picked up a little bit, but still very much down. But I want to give you some business reaction from Sir Ian Cheshire that we have here, who's chairman of Debenhams. So what do you make of what's happened today?
Well, obviously an amazing, extraordinary, historic day, and the British people have decided. So now in business terms, we have to get on with it. I think the issue now is really short term. We need the calm. So the governor's speech really important to calm markets down. But we've seen the pound is way down. Stock markets are marking down, particularly retailers. Second is we need to know who the leadership is going to be, the political leadership. And then the third bit we're going to need from a business point of view is a sense of the next 2 or 3 years. What's the plan for how do we redefine our relationship?
You mentioned the retail sector there. How hard do you think it will be hit by this?
Well, the stock market has said that we're over sort of 10-15% down this morning, because they can see that most of what we sell we import, so that's going to cost more because of the pound collapsing. Secondly, if the uncertainty of economic growth is there, then people typically spend less in shops. So from the retailer's sales line, that's not great news, and which is what we've been saying for the last few months.
Were you surprised by this? Were businesses ready, do you think, for this happening?
Well, I think most of the UK was surprised by the end result. It's difficult to prepare exactly for this because it depends again on this point of how do we actually end up working with Europe. I think what has been really noticeable is how much more divided the country has been on this issue, with basically certainly the younger population voting to stay and then certain regions voting to leave, and that degree of difference has been much more sharply marked than I would have expected.
Sir Ian Cheshire, thank you very much for your time this morning. That's it for me here at the Bank of England this morning.
Steph McGovern, thank you. Let's just show you now some images from the location in central London, where we are expecting shortly to hear from the leading figures of the Leave campaign. Boris Johnson will be speaking, Labour's Gisela Stewart and Michael Gove as well. That is expected in about 5-10 minutes' time. We will bring you that live as soon as we get it. But now let's get some reaction from Victoria Derbyshire in Manchester with a panel of people who she has assembled.
Well, Steph was talking about the events in the city and the reaction in the city. We've been talking about the economy here and people's money with voters as they drop into the People's Museum to discuss the People's Vote, which is to leave the European Union. Paddy, you voted to leave and you believed those economic forecasts from the Remain campaign and still went for leave. Why?
Yeah, after considering the forecast, I did think it was inevitable that there would be a temporary shock to the forecast, pound, the FTSE. But I think that for the point of democracy, to be able to make our own laws and to decide our own sort of future, plus the strength of the UK economy, I believe that would only be temporary, but I thought that would be...
But so a potentially a temporary recession?
Yes.
Some job losses, that will be worth it for the strength that it gives our democracy?
I believe that there would be a pessimistic sort of devalue of the pound, let's say. But I think that after a while that would pick up because I believe that the UK economy is strong.
Bex, what do you think of that? You voted to Remain.
Yeah, I voted to Remain. I think we are stronger as a bloc. I think when people talk about Great Britain, I think we've kind of moved past that point. We're a part of a global economy and we need to be part of a bigger economy.
But what about Paddy's point of view, that a temporary shock is worth it to him?
I'm not convinced, and I wanted to vote on a kind of bigger level, and I was worried about people at the bottom of the economy. I think we're going to have real problems with people at the bottom of the economy. The weakest and the poorest are going to struggle the most. I think I'm going to be okay, but I have got worries. I bought a house 10 weeks ago, and we don't know what's going to happen with the interest rates. I work in academia. A lot of that money comes from the EU. So where's all that going to go? So I've got some personal worries, but I've also got some worries for the poorer people of the world.
Jules, you voted to Remain. When you see events in the city, when you see the Governor of the Bank of England come out immediately after David Cameron to try to reassure the markets, what do you think here in Manchester?
Well, clearly we knew we was going to have a shock. It's probably been a double whammy with David Cameron going as well. We just need to stay strong and keep a resolve here. The markets have already started to move back a little bit. I think tomorrow is going to paint a lot different picture on the whole economy anyway.
Well, tomorrow's Saturday, so
when the markets indeed.
Yeah.
When the markets reopen on Monday. So it's a new day. And like I said earlier, the one thing that we don't want to happen is to talk ourselves into recession and talk ourselves down. We've got to remain positive.
Everyone is nodding in agreement.
Well, that's right. The decision has been made now, and I voted Remain for various reasons, but I'm not dismayed either by the result. So for me personally, I'm going to get behind it in any way I can, and just look forward to a brighter future. The decision's been made. Let's just all get behind it, keep smiling, and do that the best we can.
Do you feel positive, like Jules does, Bex? Do you accept the result?
I do accept the result. We're in a democracy and the decision has been made. I know there's a petition going around to overturn it. I'll be interested to see what happens with that.
What, an online petition?
Yeah,
okay.
With people saying, it wasn't representative and it's too tight and it should...
Oh my gosh, it was a huge turnout, 72%.
So I thought that's kind of fascinating. But I mean, we were out later at an industry event last night, so got up just in time to see and was really surprised. But the one thing that had persuaded me maybe towards the Leave vote was the idea that I'm in a digital economy, so it's very global, and therefore does geography actually matter that much? But I think there is still something about geography and local history and being part of an area that we've had relationships with for a long time.
Do you think that stops now?
No, I don't think it stops.
Okay.
That's what I hope. But I'm hoping that the kind of vitriol that's gone on with the campaign, that people can leave that behind and say, if this is where we're going, then we need to go this way and we need to go in a positive way.
Thank you, Bex, for the moment. Thank you, all of you. And more from Manchester a little later.
Victoria, thank you. The UK has voted to leave the European Union in the most seismic decision in generations. David Cameron has gone to see the Queen after announcing that he will resign as Prime Minister. 52% of people who cast a ballot made the momentous decision to leave the EU. The Prime Minister earlier gave an emotional address explaining his decision to go.
I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
One man who could replace him, Vote Leave campaigner Boris Johnson, battles through a scrum of police and protesters before meeting with his victorious fellow campaigners. And this is the scene at the Vote Leave headquarters in London, where Mr. Johnson is due to speak any moment now. We'll bring that to you live. Leave campaigners are jubilant at the results, saying it sends a stinging message to the European Union's political elites. But more sombre scenes in the city as the pound plunges. Financial markets also fell sharply, with bank shares among those hit hardest.
The leadership debate in the Tory party has already begun here after David Cameron's announcement that he's going, but the repercussions of yesterday's vote have rocked the whole of Westminster. What does it mean for the Labour Party and for UKIP too? I'm talking to leading politicians and commentators about what happens next in British politics and for the future of the UK and the EU.
Here in Manchester, we will talk to voters about the momentous decision that some of them have made and the dramatic ramifications. There really is quite a sombre mood in here now after David Cameron's announcement, including from Leave voters. So we will ask about people's hopes and fears for the United Kingdom now.
Good morning from Downing Street. After more than 40 years, Britain has voted to end its membership of the European Union. The vote was decisive. 52% chose to leave the EU and 48% wanted to stay. David Cameron has announced that he is to step down as Prime Minister, and he is currently at Buckingham Palace for an audience with the Queen. Mr. Cameron, who argued strongly for the Remain campaign, said the will of the people must be respected and fresh leadership was required, with a new Prime Minister in place by October. Shots there of the Prime Minister's car travelling through central London right now. Well, UKIP's leader, Nigel Farage, has called the result Britain's Independence Day. The prominent Leave campaigner, Boris Johnson, was booed by some in the crowds outside as he left his home this morning, cheered though by others. We're expecting to hear from him at a news conference in the next few minutes. Well, the final result shows that Leave secured its victory by a margin of more than 1 million votes. In total, 17.4 million people voted for the UK to leave the EU. That compares with the 16.1 million voters who backed Remain. More than 72% of eligible voters took part, a high turnout. In England, more than 15 million people voted for the UK to leave the European Union. 13.2 million people backed Remain. In Scotland, every voting area came out in favour of Remain. 62% of Scottish voters backed Remain, with 38% backing a Leave vote. In Wales, Leave won over 52% of the vote and secured the most votes in all but 5 of the 22 counting areas. In Northern Ireland, the only part of the UK that shares a border with the European Union, voters backed Remain, with 55% of voters choosing to remain in the EU, with 45% voting to leave it. Well, that is how the results across the UK look this morning. We will, of course, continue to discuss in great detail what it all is going to mean for you, what it will mean for the United Kingdom and also for the European Union. But first, our political correspondent, Carol Walker, has this report on the dramatic events so far.
There was no hiding the emotion as the Prime Minister and his wife Samantha emerged from Downing Street.
Good morning, everyone.
He said the will of the British people must be respected, but having fought and lost the battle to remain in the EU, the country should have a new Prime Minister.
I fought this campaign in the only way I know how, which is to say directly and passionately what I think and feel, head, heart and soul. I held nothing back. But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction. I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
With turmoil and uncertainty in the financial markets, the Governor of the Bank of England said it was prepared to take further action to support the British economy if necessary.
We've taken all the necessary steps to prepare for today's events, and in the future, we will not hesitate to take any additional measures required to meet our responsibilities as the United Kingdom moves forward.
From the moment the results started coming in just after midnight, there were big wins for Leave.
Ladies and gentlemen,
By the end of the night, Leave had won a clean sweep across the north of England, the Midlands, the east and west of England. London was the only region of England to support remaining a member of the EU. The result in Flintshire reflected the outcome across Wales, where voters backed Brexit. But Scotland voted by a clear majority to stay in the EU. Scotland's First Minister said it was clear that the people of Scotland see their future as part of the European Union. The results will bring fresh calls for a second referendum on Scottish independence. Northern Ireland, too, has voted to remain in the EU. Sinn Féin has said it intensifies the case for a vote on whether Northern Ireland should leave the United Kingdom. Shortly before 5 o'clock this morning, it was clear the UK had taken the historic decision to leave the European Union.
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU.
UKIP's leader, Nigel Farage, said he was thrilled that the country had decided to break free from what he called a failing, dying European Union.
70 million people have said we must leave the European Union. We now need a Brexit government. A government that gets on with the job. A government that begins the renegotiation of our trade relationship.
The Labour leader said he hoped the negotiations with the European Union would include efforts to protect British workers.
Clearly, there are some very difficult days ahead. The value of the pound has already fallen, and there will therefore be job consequences as a result of this decision.
Thank you very much.
A momentous day for Britain, for Europe, as the country embarks on a new and uncertain future, outside the EU and under a different leader. Carol Walker, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, I'm joined now by our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. We've seen David Cameron has left Buckingham Palace now. He's driving through central London. We don't know where to. Next, we are expecting to hear from the leading Leave figure, Boris Johnson, who potentially could be taking up residence here.
More than potentially, perhaps likely to be taking up residence, because he is absolutely in pole position now. We'll hear from him shortly. We haven't really heard an official response from the Leave side yet. We've heard plenty from Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage has been urging a quick retreat from Europe, if you like. He doesn't want us to hang around. Everything we've heard from the official Leave campaign is, let's not rush this. But I think we can cross actually to the Leave campaign, and there's Gisela Stewart, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. And Gisela Stewart is speaking.
Went to the voting booth and made their decision about a relationship of over 40 years with the European Union. It was the largest and most extensive democratic exercise we have seen. And the people by a majority decided that they wished to leave the European Union. Vote Leave is a cross-party organisation, and we have always acted in a way which was in the interest of the country and not in sectional interests. I think it is now incumbent to all party leaders to also reflect to what extent they are representing and reflecting the views of the voters. This is the most extraordinary opportunity of democracy. I think the process which is beginning now of implementing the wish of the people will, in the be seen as not only freeing the United Kingdom, but also be in the interest of Europe. We are still, and always have been, an exceptionally outward-looking country. We will continue to be so. We will be a good neighbour. We will be a good internationalist. But we will have taken back control of our democratic institutions.
Thank you very much, Gisela. And I want to begin this morning by paying tribute to David Cameron, who has spoken earlier from Downing Street. And I know I speak for Michael in saying how sad I am that he has decided to step down, but obviously I respect that decision. I've known David Cameron for a very long time, and I believe he's been one of the most extraordinary politicians of our age. A brave and principled man who's given superb leadership of his party and his country for many years, reforming our public services, delivering one nation conservative government, making this country the most dynamic economy in Europe, and with his own brand of compassionate conservatism that rightly earned his party the first majority government for decades. It was his bravery that gave this country the first referendum on the European Union for 43 years, the first time that many of us have had the chance to vote explicitly on this question. Today, I think all of us politicians should thank the British people, because in a way they have been doing our job for us. They hire us to deal with the hard questions, and this year we gave them one of the biggest and toughest questions of all. Some people are now saying that was wrong and that the people should never have been asked in this way. I disagree. I believe it was entirely right and inevitable, and indeed that there is no way of dealing with a decision on this scale except by putting it to the people. Because in the end, this question is about the people. It's about the right of the people of this country to settle their own destiny. It's about the very principles of our democracy, the rights of all of us to elect and remove the people who make the key decisions in their lives. And I think that the electorate have searched in their hearts and answered as honestly as they can, and as Gisela says, in a poll on a scale the like of which we have never seen before in this country, they have decided that it is time to vote to take back control. From a European Union that has become too remote, too opaque, and not accountable enough to the people it is meant to serve. In voting to leave the EU, it is vital to stress that there is now no need for haste, and indeed, as the Prime Minister has just said, nothing will change over the short term, except that work will have to begin on how to give effect to the will of the people and to extricate this country from the supranational system. And as the Prime Minister has rightly said, there is no need to invoke Article 50. And to those who may be anxious, whether at home or abroad, this does not mean that the United Kingdom will be in any way less united, nor indeed does it mean that it will be any less European. And I want to speak to the millions of people, directly to the millions of people who did not vote for this outcome, especially young people, who may feel that this decision in some way involves pulling up a drawbridge or any kind of isolationism, because I think the very opposite is true. We cannot turn our backs on Europe. We are part of Europe. Our children and our grandchildren will continue to have a wonderful future as Europeans travelling to the continent, understanding the languages and cultures that make up our common European civilization, continuing to interact with the peoples of other countries in a way that is open and friendly and outward-looking. And I want to reassure everybody that, in my view, as a result of this, Britain will continue to be a great European power, leading discussions on foreign policy and defence and intelligence sharing and all the work that currently goes on to make our world safer. But there is simply no need in the 21st century to be part of a federal system of government based in Brussels that is imitated nowhere else on earth. It was a noble idea for its time. It is no longer right for this country. And it is the essence of our case that young people in this country can look forward to a more secure and more prosperous future if we take back the democratic control that is the foundation of our economic prosperity. I believe we now have a glorious opportunity. We can pass our laws and set our taxes entirely according to the needs of the UK economy. We can control our own borders in a way that is not discriminatory, but fair and balanced, and take the wind out of the sails of the extremists and those who would play politics with immigration. Above all, we can find our voice in the world again, a voice that is commensurate with the fifth biggest economy on earth. Powerful, liberal, humane, an extraordinary force for good in the world. And the most precious thing this country has given our continent is the idea of parliamentary democracy. This Thursday, yesterday, I believe the British people have spoken up for democracy in Britain and across Europe. And I think we can be very proud of the result. Thank you finally to everybody at Vote Leave for the extraordinary and positive campaign you have run. Thank you.
I want to join Boris in paying tribute to the Prime Minister. He has led this country with courage, dignity and grace. He and the Chancellor rebuilt our economy. He has made opportunity more equal in our society. He has exemplified the very best in public service. He deserves to be remembered as a great Prime Minister. He called this referendum so the British people could decide one big question. Should we leave the political structures of the European Union? The British people have given us all a very clear instruction, and I know that we in politics will work calmly, cooperatively, and consensually to implement that instruction from the people. The British people's vote to leave is the start of a process, and while that process is ongoing, our existing trading relationships with the European Union and the rest of the world will continue as before. In the coming days, government ministers and officials can meet to decide the next steps. Officials and diplomats can start scoping out the broad parameters for full-scale talks with our European friends and with the institutions in Brussels. Our shared mission is clear: securing the best possible terms for Britain. And of course, informal discussions should precede our formal negotiations. Overall, the changes that we will see will be a process of gradual divergence. And it's important that representatives from every part of the United Kingdom, every community, and different political traditions are involved in shaping our future. And we should draw on wisdom from great minds outside politics. As we move forward, we should be in no doubt that Britain is embarking on a new chapter, but one that is in line with our best traditions. We have always been an open, inclusive, tolerant, creative, and generous nation. Open for business, open to trade, open to other cultures, open to the world. Now, we have a new chance to extend that openness even further. We can build a new, stronger, and more positive relationship with our European neighbours based on free trade and friendly cooperation. We can have democratic consent for an immigration policy that is fairer and more humane. We can demonstrate that our progressive, liberal and democratic traditions are being renewed and that we stand with all our allies as resolute as ever against intolerance and oppression. We can take our place as a self-governing democracy alongside other great nations, working for greater global development, security and prosperity. And we can now, calmly and united, take our country forward in the spirit of the warm, humane and generous values that are the best of Britain. Thank you.
Michael Gove, Boris Johnson and Gisela Stewart leaving the stage there in central London. Our assistant political editor Norman Smith is here with me now. I mean, calm, statesmanlike, measured, almost a sombre tone. What did you make of what they had to say?
They know this has been a profoundly divisive contest. Indeed, you know, it split the country. And so the message was one of reassurance and binding together. I thought it interesting that Boris Johnson very deliberately went out of his way to appeal to young people. The indications being they've overwhelmingly voted to remain in, and saying to them, look, it does not mean we are turning our back on Europe. Likewise, to those who say he has fanned the flames of intolerance, he said by voting to leave, that will take the wind out of the sail of the extremists and those who played politics with the issue of immigration. And in the short term, stressing that nothing is going to change. Article 50, which would kickstart the whole process, it doesn't need to be triggered automatically. I think the message was to sound statesmanlike, sombre, sober, and to try and reassure people that there is a brighter future and to calm the very understandable fears many will have.
And saying that Britain will continue to be a great European power. That's what Boris Johnson was very keen to stress.
I mean, he has always argued that we will have much more cordial relations with the rest of Europe when we feel more self-confident in ourselves, when we are less sort of the reluctant, embittered parts of the European Union. And I think he genuinely believes that we will reshape maybe the way the whole of Europe now operates. That is part of his overall pitch.
Well, let's go now to Brussels, because the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, is speaking there right now.
With all rights and with all obligations that derive from this. According to the treaties which the United Kingdom has ratified, EU law continues to apply to the full to and in the United Kingdom until it is no longer a matter. As agreed, the new settlement for the United Kingdom within the European Union reached at the European Council in February this year will now not take effect and ceases to exist. There will be no renegotiation. There will be no renegotiation. As regards the United Kingdom, we hope to have it as a close partner of the European Union in the future. We expect the United Kingdom to formulate its proposals in this respect. Any agreement which will be concluded with the UK as a third country will have to reflect the interests of both sides and be balanced in terms of rights and in terms of obligations. I will take 2 questions and a half.
Thank you, Cécile. Ah, pardon.
These are too much.
Cécile.
Cécile Ducourtieu du journal Le Monde. Qu'attendez-vous du moteur
We'd refer to the Franco-German driving force within the European Union. What do you expect from that now over the next few days? President Juncker, well, it's called indeed the driving force, and I expect France and Germany to take a very clear position.
OK, well, we're going to leave Jean-Claude Juncker there speaking in Brussels, because we're going to go straight to Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon.
Scotland, like London and Northern Ireland, voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. We voted to protect our place in the world's biggest single market and the jobs and investment that depend on it. We voted to safeguard our freedom to travel, live, work and study in other European countries. And we voted to renew our reputation as an outward-looking, open and inclusive country. It is significant, in my view, that we did so after a campaign that was positive about the EU and about the benefits of migration. Indeed, I want to take the opportunity this morning to speak directly to citizens of other European countries living here in Scotland. You remain welcome here. Scotland is your home and your contribution is valued. Unfortunately, of course, yesterday's result in Scotland was not echoed across the whole of the United Kingdom. The UK-wide vote to leave the EU is one that I deeply regret. It remains my passionate belief that it is better for all parts of the UK to be members of the European Union. But the vote across England and Wales was a rejection of the EU, and it was a sign of divergence between Scotland and large parts of the rest of the UK and how we see our place in the world. But this vote wasn't just about the EU. It was also a clear expression of the disaffection with the political system that is felt in too many communities. Communities taken for granted by Labour for generations and punished with austerity cuts by the Tories for a financial crisis they didn't cause, used this referendum to make their voices heard. The Westminster establishment has some serious soul-searching to do, and I hope very much that it now does it. But as First Minister of Scotland, I have a duty to respond not just to the outcome across the UK, but also and in particular to the democratic decision taken by the people of Scotland. As things stand, Scotland faces the prospect of being taken out of the EU against our will. I regard that as democratically unacceptable. And of course, we face that prospect less than 2 years after being told that it was our own referendum on independence that would end our membership of the European Union and that only a rejection of independence could protect it. Indeed, for many people, the supposed guarantee of remaining in the EU was a driver in their decision to vote to stay within the UK. So there is no doubt that yesterday's result represents a significant and a material change of the circumstances in which Scotland voted against independence in 2014. My job now is to act responsibly and in the interests of all of Scotland, and that is what I intend to do. The Cabinet will meet tomorrow morning to discuss our next steps in more detail, but I want to set out now some immediate priorities. Firstly, we have an urgent job to do to provide as much reassurance and certainty as we can. I spoke a short while ago to the Governor of the Bank of England to discuss his plans to reassure the markets and restore financial stability. Starting this afternoon, ministers will be engaged in discussions with key stakeholders, particularly in the business community, to emphasise that as of now we are still firmly in the EU, trade and business should continue as normal, and we are determined that Scotland will continue now and in the future to be an attractive and a stable place to do business. Our Resilience Committee will meet later this afternoon to oversee these immediate actions. Secondly, I want to make it absolutely clear today that I intend to take all possible steps and explore all options to give effect to how people in Scotland voted. In other words, to secure our continuing place in the EU and in the single market in particular. To that end, I have made clear to the Prime Minister this morning that the Scottish Government must be fully and directly involved in any and all decisions about the next steps that the UK Government intends to take. We will also be seeking direct discussions with the EU institutions and its member states, including the earliest possible meeting with the President of the European Commission. I will also be communicating over this weekend with each EU member state to make clear that Scotland has voted to stay in the EU, and I intend to discuss all options for doing so. I should say that I've also spoken this morning with Mayor Sadiq Khan, and he is clear that he shares this objective for London. So there is clear common cause between us. The discussions that take place over the coming days and weeks will, of course, be led by government, but I will seek the support and ensure the involvement of the Scottish Parliament at every step of the way. I intend to speak to all party leaders later today and make a full statement to the Chamber on Tuesday. I will also make a further statement following tomorrow's meeting of the Scottish Cabinet. Lastly, let me address the issue of a second independence referendum. The manifesto that the SNP was elected on last month said this: the Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. Scotland does now face that prospect. It is a significant and material change in circumstances, and it is therefore a statement of the obvious that the option of a second referendum must be on the table, and it is on the table. Clearly, though, there are many discussions to be had before final decisions can be taken. It would not be right to rush to judgment ahead of discussions on how Scotland's result will be responded to by the EU. However, when the Article 50 process is triggered in 3 months' time, the UK will be on a 2-year path to the EU exit door. If Parliament judges that a second referendum is the best or only way to protect our place in Europe, it must have the option to hold one within that timescale. That means we must act now to protect that position. I can therefore confirm today that in order to protect that position, we will begin to prepare the legislation that would be required to enable a new independence referendum to take place if and when Parliament so decides. To conclude, this is not a situation that I wanted Scotland or the UK to be in today. But my responsibility in a climate of uncertainty is to seek to lead us forward with purpose. I know that there is a lot of thinking and talking to be done in the period that lies ahead and before final decisions are taken. The issues that we face are complex. There are many people who voted against independence in 2014 who are today reassessing their decision. Indeed, a very large number of them have contacted me already. However, I know that they will not want me to simply assume their support or to hear me talk about the challenges we face as if they are straightforward. They will want me to be straight and honest with them. Now is the time for me as First Minister to do everything I can to bring people together in common cause and to seek to lead our country forward as one. The need to act decisively must be tempered with the need to build consensus, and it will be. That is my duty as First Minister. After a campaign that has been characterised in the rest of the UK by fear and hate, my priority in the days, weeks and months ahead will be to act at all times in the best interests of Scotland and in a way that unites, not divides us. And let me also be clear about this. Whatever happens as a result of this outcome, England, Wales and Northern Ireland will always be Scotland's closest neighbours and our best friends. Nothing will ever change that. But I want to leave no one in any doubt about this. I am proud of Scotland and how we voted yesterday. We proved that we are a modern, outward-looking, open and inclusive country. And we said clearly that we do not want to leave the European Union. I am determined that we will do what it takes to make sure that these aspirations are realised. In closing, let me just say a word or two about the Prime Minister. David Cameron and I have very many political disagreements, not least over the conduct of this referendum. But as I am learning every single day, leadership is not easy. David has been the Prime Minister of the UK for 6 years. It is a tough job, and whatever our disagreements, he deserves our thanks for his service. I wish him and his family well for the future. With these comments, I'm happy to take some questions. Glenn Campbell.
First Minister, if not an independence referendum, what other options are available to you?
Well, I think an independence referendum is now highly likely, but I also think it's important that we take time to consider all steps and to have the discussions, not least to assess the response of the European Union to the vote that Scotland expressed yesterday. I am absolutely determined in my responsibility to give effect to how Scotland voted yesterday, and it's important that I take all steps to make sure that we explore all options to do exactly that. Colin.
Is that independence referendum that you say is highly likely, will that go ahead with or without consent of Westminster? Because you had consent the last time.
Well, obviously, we would seek to follow the same precedent that we did the last time. But, you know, I think in the circumstances where the Scottish Parliament decides that that option is an option that it wants to exercise, I think it would be inconceivable that, particularly in the circumstances that have given rise to this, that the UK government would seek to stand in its way. But of course, these are some of the discussions that we will be seeking to have in the days and weeks ahead. I'll take Peter.
First Minister, you say you want Scotland to remain in the EU. You say that to do that you're likely to propose a referendum. The rest of the UK will be out of the EU. That must mean there will be a border between Scotland, a proper, real border between Scotland and England.
These are issues that we now have to assess and consider, and we have to do that calmly and rationally. That's why I have said very, very clearly in the remarks I've made today that I am not going to stand here and pretend to anybody that the issues we face are straightforward. We face many complex issues, which is another reason why, in addition to being determined about giving effect to how Scotland voted, I'm going to take the time to make sure that all of Scotland considers all of these issues and has the chance to move forward as one. I think that is of the utmost importance at this time. Sarah.
First Minister, are you confident that in the potential turmoil that could follow a Brexit, that those are circumstances in which Scotland will want to vote for independence?
I think in the circumstances of turmoil, and can I say I don't want to see turmoil affecting any part of the United Kingdom. I believe the decision that was taken across the UK yesterday was the wrong decision, a mistake. But I hope very much that some of the fears that were had about it are not realised, because it would not be in the interests of people anywhere in the UK if they are. But I'm not sure that is not more in hope than in expectation. But it is exactly because of the uncertainty and the potential turmoil that we face that I think it is in my responsibility to seek to bring Scotland together, to lead Scotland forward into a position that allows us to continue with the stability and the certainty that membership of the European Union gives us. I am not saying that these issues are straightforward, but I do think that is the responsibility and indeed the opportunity that now lies before us. But I'll take Martin.
Presumably you don't want to risk losing another referendum. You'll call it when the polls tell you you're almost certain to win it. What level of support do you need at the polls?
My guiding principle in every decision I take over these next days, weeks and months will be what I judge to be in the best interest, not of the SNP or as me as First Minister, but what I judge to be in the best interest of Scotland. That is the responsibility I have, and that's how I will guide every decision I take. Right, I'll take one more question.
You just said the vote shows that Scotland is forward-looking. Does it follow then that England and Wales are backward-looking?
The decision that was taken in other parts of the UK is a decision that people took democratically after much consideration. It's a decision I deeply disagreed with, but I respect the decision that has been taken. But I said during the campaign that I believed it was important to protect our position in the European Union and in the wider world as an outward-looking, inclusive country. I think that's what Scotland voted for yesterday, and that's the position I want to protect. I'll take one more question.
First Minister,
yes.
Article 50. Your predecessor, Alex Salmond, has said he thinks it's absolutely crucial.
OK, well, we're going to leave Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, answering journalist questions there now, because we're going to go straight to Germany, where the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, has just been giving her reaction. She has expressed her great regret at the decision that the UK has taken.
European integration, what the day of today means for the next few weeks and months and years will largely depend on as to whether we, the remaining 27 member states of the European Union, show our willingness and ability in this situation not to be too hasty and come to hasty decisions out of Britain's exit decision which would further intensify rifts in Europe. Instead, we have to remain calm and composed. We need to make composed and calm analyses and decisions. In doing so, we need to make sure that, firstly, Europe is varied, and as varied as the peoples of Europe are, their expectations to the European Union are also varied. Time and time again, we are confronted with people who have doubts as regards the direction that the European integration process has taken. That does not only refer to Great Britain, but in some extent or another extent to other countries as well. So, therefore, we have to make sure that European citizens can feel how the European Union can actually make a contribution for the improvement of the citizens' lives. That is a task for the European institutions, but also for the individual member states. Secondly, in a world that continually integrates, the challenges are far too large in order to make sure that individual states can tackle these challenges. The European Union is one of the largest economic areas of the world. It needs to understand itself as a partner that is accompanying globalization and is able and willing to shape the globalization process. It is a unique society and community of values and ethics, and it is a guarantor of stability. It is only in this fashion that we can guarantee our ideas, our interests, be it social interests, be it ecological interests, be it foreign policy interests and defense policies. It is only then that we can actually maintain our ideas. Thirdly, we have to draw our conclusions of the European exit decision with historical dimensions. It may be hard to imagine, but we should never forget, especially in these days and hours, that the idea of the European unity is the idea of European peace. After centuries of terrible bloodshed, the founding fathers of the European Union found a path which they enshrined these ideas in the Roman treaties nearly 60 years ago. This is and will remain in the future something which is not to be taken for granted. We all see that this world is a world in turmoil. In Europe, we still feel the effects of riots, of unrest, and of wars. Wars that have cost the lives of so many people, and wars that have evicted so many people from their countries. Germany has a specific interest and also a specific responsibility for the European integration to succeed. Hence, I invited the French President François Hollande and Donald Tusk and the Italian Prime Minister Mr. Renzi to come to Berlin for talks. On Wednesday next week, we are going to increase the circle in order to make our discussions more profound in Brussels. For a member to leave the European Union, we have a clearly designed process. This process envisages many-year negotiations that are to deal with the various aspects of Great Britain leaving the European Union. While the negotiations take place, Great Britain remains a member of the European Union. All rights and all obligations that are a result of the membership will still be in effect until the membership is totally removed. That remains in place for all parties. Our objective should be to design our cooperation and our partnership with Britain as closely as possible. One of our main focus areas for the federal government will be the European citizens and their safety and their prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, the European Union is strong enough in order to find the right answers to today. I will be active with the entire federal government.
That was the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, speaking there in Berlin. Greatly regrets, she says, the UK decision to leave the European Union. She has called for calm. She says it is important to stay calm and composed. Let's get some more reaction now from College Green. Andrew Neil is there.
Thanks, sir. I'm joined by John Nicholson, SNP MP, and by Stanley Johnson, who is campaigning to remain, but is, among other things, the father of Boris Johnson. John Nicholson, Scotland voted to stay by a pretty big majority. England has voted to leave. The overwhelming votes mean that the UK will leave as a whole. What would be the argument against another referendum on independence?
Well, I can't think of one off the top of my head. If you remember, during the independence referendum, and of course you do because you covered it closely, we were told repeatedly that if we voted for independence, we'd be out of the European Union, but that if we voted against independence, it would guarantee our membership. Now, that argument has collapsed with the vote yesterday, and we cannot, it seems to me, be dragged out of the European Union against our will.
So there will be another Scottish referendum, in your view?
I think it's highly likely, yes.
Highly likely?
I think it's highly likely.
Why not certain?
Well, I think, clearly we've got to react calmly to this. We've got to talk to the other political leaders in Scotland. It would be ideal if we could move forward with a degree of consensus. Because the Better Together leaders, the Labour and Conservative and Lib Dem leaders, all promised us this wouldn't happen. So I'm quite interested in hearing what they have to say this afternoon, because clearly they misled the Scottish people because they believed that we would stay in the European Union. What's their reaction to this?
Well, we'll try and find out as the day goes on. Stanley Johnson, didn't you call for independence for London?
Well, that was a bit of a joke. A bit of a joke, something like that. No, my line was to fight for environmental features, to feature in the referendum. We didn't succeed, but I'm particularly wearing this now because I was wearing it all last night. We believe that we've jolly well got to make sure that in whatever follows, we do preserve the vital environmental gains which we've had from 40 years of being in Europe, and we look to the future as well. I mean, that's the point. I mean, yes. I mean, apart from that, I think it's a day which we recognise. It's a day when the country has voted. Country has voted.
You lost.
We lost, but I rejoice. We had a fantastic exercise of democracy. We had, 32 million people.
You rejoice.
Of course, I rejoice.
What would you be doing if you'd won?
Well, I'd be climbing up to the top of the tower.
Is your son going to be the next Prime Minister of this country?
Do you know something? He's going to, I hope, put his name forward as one of the possible candidates, but he would need to be selected by the MPs. That's the way it goes. Tory MPs, by the way, I think. That's how it goes. He'd have to. I think he'd stand a chance of making the shortlist. That's what I think. If he delivered 17 million votes, for Leave, he ought to get. Well, have a chance to be one of the two names on the shortlist.
Well, he's very popular in the Tory party in the country. So if he makes the shortlist, which is then determined by the Tory party, not the MPs, then he wins, I would have thought. Does he not?
I hope he takes a good notice of the environmental dimension of the whole thing. That's what I think. I mean, not that I'm going to, bother him about this, but I just think these are the crucial issues which we need to look ahead as we rebuild this relationship.
John Nicholson, I take the point about Scotland and England voting to go different ways, and therefore the case for a second referendum. Are you sure you would win a second referendum? I mean, for example, if we're talking of a situation where an independent Scotland is a member of the EU and the rest of the UK, or particularly England, is not, you'd almost certainly have to take the euro, because you would not be allowed to be part of the London-based monetary union.
That's certainly one possibility. A separate Scottish currency pegged to the pound or pegged to the euro is another possibility. On the question of whether or not we would win, my constituency, East and Bartonshire, as you know, voted very heavily for the European Union last night. It was the third largest in the country. It also voted quite heavily against independence. So let me tell you my personal experience going around the doors. When I go around the doors campaigning and talk to people who voted against independence, I quite often hear people telling me that were the UK to vote against the European Union, they would change their views on independence. We're talking about businessmen, for example.
I understand that.
We're really going to...
You're not going to have this referendum until probably towards the end of the decade. That seemed to be the implication while the Article 50 is being triggered. So before 2020. But it could be a condition of membership that you would have to accept the euro. 90% of Scottish exports come to England. You'd be trading in there in a foreign currency. You'd have currency risk. Oil prices may not have recovered. There may well be a border between Carlisle and Berwick. It may not be as easy an argument as you think it is this morning.
Well, I haven't said I think it's an easy argument. These are political battles that we still have to face. I just get a sense, my instinct is that people are waking up this morning and being astonished at the result, because I think in Scotland people didn't focus on how English voters were likely to behave in this referendum, and I think a lot of Scottish voters are going to be very surprised at this result.
Stanley Johnson, has your son taken us out of one union and then to lead to the destruction of another union known as the United Kingdom?
Hey, let's take one step at a time. I just listened to his press conference. I thought that was a statesman-like press conference, and the statement he made I thought was full of wisdom and maturity.
What's the answer to my question?
The answer is, I do not for one moment imagine, I say this with great respect to you, John, I do not for one moment imagine that we will move towards a referendum in Scotland which comes to a yes vote.
Really?
Because I see the resurgence of the Tory party in Scotland combined with the low oil price as being something which means you are simply not going to get that vote in Scotland.
We better leave it there. It's an argument for another day, and that other day will be coming, I suspect.
Thank you.
We'll leave it there. Let's go back to Sophie in Downing Street.
Andrew, thank you very much. Well, of course, the decision that was taken by the British people yesterday has all kinds of implications and all kinds of questions about what happens next. Our legal affairs correspondent, Clive Coleman, is with me. Talk us through the very simple, practical steps that will happen over the next few months.
Absolutely. Well, it all comes under Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union. Now, that's pretty new. It only came into force under the Lisbon Treaty. It's only been around since December 2009. And there is no route map. It doesn't set down a strict timetable or a series of things that have to happen. What has to happen is that the British government has to inform the President of the European Council that we intend to leave. Once that is done, the clock starts ticking. Now, within that period, and it ticks for 2 years, and at the end of that 2-year period, we are out. We are no longer a member of the EU, unless that period is extended, and that has to be extended by agreement. So within that period, an agreement can be done in a number of ways, Sophie. Either it can be done between the UK and the EU as a whole, which seems likely, but it is possible that you can have what's known as a mixed agreement if individual member states face specific budgetary implications. Then you can have a deal between the UK on the one hand and the EU and individual member states on the other. Now that, if it did happen, could prolong this process beyond the 2 years. The other option, of course, is that there is no agreement, and after 2 years we simply leave the EU. We become like any third-party state negotiating with the EU. One important thing I think to mention is that this negotiation, this agreement that we're hoping to conclude within 2 years, is the basic divorce settlement, if I can put it in that way. It doesn't necessarily mean that the trade deal will be done and dusted within that period. It might be, but trade deals are notoriously lengthy and difficult things to conclude. Sometimes they take a decade, sometimes 2 decades. So there's no guarantee that by the end of that 2-year period, we'll have a deal on trade, we'll have a deal on the free movement of goods. The deal is going to be the basic divorce settlement. It may include those things, it may not.
Okay, thank you very much, Clive. We're going to go now to Brussels because Europe, of course, has been reacting with shock to the vote to leave. Matthew Amroliwala is in Brussels for us now. Matthew.
Sophie, thanks very much. Very interesting listening to what Clive was just saying there about Article 50. Let me tell you, in the last few minutes, Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker has been talking. He said he regretted the decision but respected it, but then went on to say any delay would unnecessarily prolong uncertainty. We have the rules to deal with this in an orderly way. Let's speak to two MEPs who are here with me, Philippe Lambert and Beatrix von Storck. Thanks, both of you, for joining us here. Philippe, you, first of all, your reaction.
Well, it's a big disappointment. I'd still hoped that reason would prevail and that the UK would remain part of the European Union. Now I respect the will of a majority of British citizens. I think that this should really be a wake-up call to European decision makers on the continent as well, because let's face it, Euroscepticism is not something specific to the United Kingdom, and if an increasing number of our citizens grow disenfranchised with the European project, that means that something is wrong.
Before we came on, you were saying there's anger as well, and in your view, anger aimed at David Cameron.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think he behaved totally irresponsibly, and now, after creating this mess, leaving it to others to clean it up is utterly irresponsible. I do not believe that this was the traditional British leadership. We've seen British leaders of another quality in the past, and I would aspire to see others. I won't miss him.
Beatrix, you said an interesting thing, which was, as a German, you would have voted Remain. If you were British, you would have voted Leave. Just explain that conundrum.
Because on the German taxpayers' point of view, we are losing the second biggest net payer. So I guess that it's probably not Greece or Italy to pay then what is lacking. But I think it might be a sad day for the European Union and its institutions, but it's a good day for Europe. Europe is based on sovereign democracies and sovereign states, and the people make clear that they don't want to have the ever closer union. This political concept has failed. People do not support it, and all the parties who are speaking out that way gaining ground. And I think this is good, and so I think this was a good day today.
So is this the moment where closer integration screeches to a halt in terms of that contagion, the domino effect? Is that a real possibility, do you think?
I think a referendum is a real concept. We have to ask the people. Why not ask the people in all the countries, do you support the idea of ever closer union? Every time when the people had the possibility to decide, that was in Netherlands, that was in Ireland, that was in France, people voted against. It's only the parliaments, it's only the elites who are voting and pushing forward the whole time, and we're losing the people, and the people want a referendum, and if they have the referendum, they take another direction.
How
I think
tough,
that's good.
how long is it going to take to actually get a deal on free trade, on those issues that have dominated the campaign of sovereignty on immigration, do you think?
Well, we don't know, of course, because we never had such a case. But what Ms. von Storch really doesn't get is that if you really want sovereignty, facing the migration challenges, the terrorism challenges, the climate change challenge, controlling the multinationals, she doesn't understand that actually to regain sovereignty, we have to pull it. That's the only way to be strong enough to mean something and to shape our future. No country in Europe is big enough on its own to really shape its future. It's only together we can do that.
Just one sentence from both of you, briefly, emotionally, after 40 years of this union, where are you today emotionally?
Emotionally, I would say, especially the migrant crisis shows that it's only the sovereign decision of sovereign states who now is pushing back the migrant crisis a little bit. It's the Balkans who closed the borders, it's Austria closed the borders. It's not the European solution. Europe has failed completely on that behalf, and so I think it's Juncker and Schulz who should step down, because it's their political concept which does not work.
Well, today I remain a committed European, because it's only together that we can really regain sovereignty, but I'm equally committed to changing the political course, because it cannot be that Europe is working for a tiny minority and leaving the majority of our peoples behind.
Do you have any idea, as we stand here now discussing this, just how it is likely to pan out in the weeks and months? When do you think the negotiations might start? Because very different noises coming from London to here in Brussels.
Of course, Cameron is seeking again to buy time by his early retirement. I do not think that this is an excuse for not starting the negotiations right away, because they will be long.
Article 50, straight away.
Absolutely. I mean, we should have a demand, a request based on Article 50 at the Council later this week, and then, well, the process should start, because we know it's going to be long, but there's absolutely no reason, and certainly not internal Tory party politics, to delay the beginning of the negotiation. That would really be shameful on behalf of David Cameron.
Beatrix, do you have any sort of idea in your head, a model of where Britain can actually end up in terms of a relationship with the EU now?
We can see that Europe consists of more than 50 countries, and 28 and now 27 members of the European Union, or will be. So we can see that there are several countries who do very well without being members of the European of the European Union. So look at Norway or Swiss or other countries. They do very well. They didn't even enter the European Union, and I don't have the feeling that they are bad off. So it is possible to survive within Europe without being member of the European Union, and one kind of trade even with countries without the euro. So that functions.
There we have to leave it. Beatrix, Philippe, thanks to both of you. We will have plenty more coverage from here, from Westminster. Do stay with us here on BBC News.
The UK has voted to leave the European Union in the most seismic decision in generations. David Cameron has met the Queen this morning after announcing he will resign as Prime Minister. 52% of people who cast a ballot made the momentous decision to leave the EU. Boris Johnson, who led the Leave campaign, paid tribute to the outgoing Prime Minister.
There is simply no need in the 21st century to be part of a federal system of government based in Brussels that is imitated nowhere else on earth. It was a noble idea for its time. It is no longer right for this country.
A visibly emotional David Cameron earlier stood outside the door of number 10 with his wife Samantha to explain his decision to leave.
I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
There is dismay in the city as the pound plunges. Financial markets also fell sharply, with bank shares among those hardest hit. And the future of the UK is again on the table as Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says a second independence referendum is highly likely after Scots voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU.
Yes, it is. Votes already claimed the scalp of the Prime Minister, and it shocked the whole political establishment here in Westminster, where crowds are gathering, helicopters in the air, and trouble in Labour's ranks too, and the prospect of a fresh referendum on Scottish independence. I'm talking to leading politicians and commentators about all this as British politics tries to come to terms with the result.
And voters here in Manchester taking in, absorbing all the new information that emerges with each news conference. What is dominating conversation now is that second, highly likely independence referendum in Scotland.
Good afternoon from Downing Street. After more than 40 years, Britain has voted to end its membership of the European Union. The vote was decisive. 52% chose to leave the EU, 48% wanted to stay. David Cameron has met the Queen at Buckingham Palace to formally tell her of his intention to resign as Prime Minister. In the past hour, we've heard from Boris Johnson, Jean-Claude Juncker, Nicola Sturgeon and Angela Merkel, amongst many other world leaders. And we'll have all the latest developments on that in a moment. First, though, let's take a closer look at the final result, which shows that Leave secured its victory by a margin of more than 1 million votes. In total, 17.4 million people voted for the UK to leave the EU. That compares with the 16.1 million voters who backed Remain. More than 72% of eligible voters took part, a high turnout. In England, more than 15 million people voted for the UK to leave the European Union. 13.2 million people backed Remain. In Scotland, every voting area came out in favour of Remain. 62% of Scottish voters backed Remain, with 38% backing a Leave vote. In Wales, Leave won over 52% of the vote and secured the most votes in all but 5 of the 22 counting areas. In Northern Ireland, which shares a land border with the European Union, voters backed Remain, with 55% of voters choosing to remain in the EU, 45% voting to leave it. While speaking here outside number 10 at about 8:15 this morning, the Prime Minister said that he would steady the ship over the coming months, but that fresh leadership was required.
I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction. I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination. This is not a decision I've taken lightly, but I do believe it's in the national interest to have a period of stability and then the new leadership required. There is no need for a precise timetable today, but in my view we should aim to have a new Prime Minister in place by the start of the Conservative Party conference in October.
Well, one of the politicians who led the campaign to leave, the former Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, has paid tribute to the Prime Minister as one of the most extraordinary politicians of our age. Mr. Johnson said people had spoken up for democracy and Britain was not turning its back on Europe. Boris Johnson said the UK now had an opportunity to find its voice in the world again.
I believe we now have a glorious opportunity. We can pass our laws and set our taxes entirely according to the needs of the UK economy. We can control our own borders in a way that is not discriminatory, but fair and balanced, and take the wind out of the sails of the extremists and those who would play politics with immigration.
And as we've been hearing, the voting patterns have highlighted sharp divisions across the United Kingdom. More than 62% of people in Scotland voted to stay in the EU, raising the prospect of Scotland being taken out of the EU against its will. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has told a news conference a short time ago that it was a statement of the obvious that the option of a second referendum was now on the table.
When the Article 50 process is triggered in 3 months' time, the UK will be on a 2-year path to the EU exit door. If Parliament judges that a second referendum is the best or only way to protect our place in Europe, it must have the option to hold one within that timescale. That means we must act now to protect that position. I can therefore confirm today that in order to protect that position, we will begin to prepare the legislation that would be required to enable a new independence referendum to take place if and when Parliament so decides.
Nicola Sturgeon speaking a short time ago. Our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, is with me now. So much reaction, so much changing in such a short time, and questions now about the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn.
Events are moving extraordinarily quickly. A letter of no confidence has now been tabled in Jeremy Corbyn from Margaret Hodge and Anne Coffey, two very senior Labour figures. That has been sent to the chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party, a man called John Cryer. He will consider it. That should then be put to a meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party for discussion on Monday. If it is accepted, it is quite possible a ballot will begin on whether there should be a challenge to Jeremy Corbyn on Tuesday. So in other words, Mr Cameron obviously has gone this morning. We have the prospect of a second independence referendum, with Nicola Sturgeon clearly indicating that is her one option that is on the table. And now we also have a question mark about whether Jeremy Corbyn will remain as Labour leader. In other words, this whole referendum has pretty much thrown the whole political jigsaw up in the table, and who knows how it's going to end.
Seismic is the word we keep hearing over and over again. However you voted, we haven't seen anything like this for generations.
But you know, the funny thing about it all is what happens here is the least important part of the whole story. I mean, on any other day, month, year, a Prime Minister resigning, a Labour leader facing a challenge, a possible second independence referendum, that would be massive. They are all big, but they pale in comparison to the enormity of the historic decision we as a nation have now taken. We have basically decided to move away from a settled 40-year period of history when we were part of the common market, the European Union. It is one of those benchmark moments in our island story when we have very consciously decided to take another step in another direction. That is a massive, massive story. It's very difficult, really. Certainly in my lifetime, I can't think of as big a moment. It's one of those profound, life-changing, historic turning point decisions, which actually, despite all the things that are going on today, totally overshadows all of that. The only other thing to say is the pace at which everything is now moving. The leadership contest for Jeremy Corbyn may well begin next week. The leadership contest for David Cameron, I suspect, is pretty much already underway in the privacy of the rooms of key players in the Tory party who will now be considering their options and whether they should stand or whether they should not stand. We will have to move pretty quickly in terms, I would think, of a different sort of shadow cabinet as well.
But briefly, we awoke this morning a divided nation.
Yes, that is, I suppose, what was most striking about the press conference by the Brexiteers, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. There was no crowing, there was no jubilation, there was no going, yeah, we've won. It was sombre, it was sober, because they know there are many, many people, yes, some will be, cheered and delighted, others are anxious, are worried, are fretful, and I thought it particularly significant. Boris Johnson went out of his way to appeal to younger voters, saying, look, this doesn't mean we're less European, we're still part of the European continent. Our children and grandchildren, they will still be Europeans, and in many ways he thinks our relationship with Europe will be better. But their tone and the message, I think, underlines the fact they know that this referendum has exposed deep, deep divisions in this country, not just geographically, but also socially, culturally, and somehow that has to be put together again.
Norman Smith, for now, thank you. So much reaction, politicians continuing to react, of course, this morning to what's been called an Independence Day by UKIP after Britain voted to leave the EU, and also reaction to the subsequent resignation of David Cameron. Andrew Neil is on College Green with plenty more reaction. Andrew.
Thanks, Sophie. It's a bit of a circus down here, actually. There's people all over the place. There's some demonstrators have joined us. They're quite noisy as well. The world's media is here. It's not just the British press is here today. There are TV crews, broadcasters from all over the world, from Asia, Europe, United States and Australia and other parts of the Commonwealth too. And we also have Dan Hannan. He's a member of the European Parliament, a Tory. He was campaigning to leave. Damien Green, Tory MP. He was campaigning to remain. Chris Leslie, Labour MP, campaigning to remain as well. Dan Hannan, we've heard this morning from leading European figures, the Brussels Commission, the Parliament and so on, that they want to begin the renegotiations or the divorce proceedings right away. They don't want to delay. And yet it seems that it's the tactic of the British government to hold on for a while.
Well, there are bound to be frayed tempers in the immediate aftermath, and it's important that there should be a cooling off period before we begin talks. Obviously, there's going to be a change in personnel in the UK. When that process has been complete, we can then move towards a phased repatriation of power. I think it's very important to stress that quite a lot of what we're doing will remain in place. I mean, we have to recognise that Damien's side got 48% of the vote. An enormous number of people watching voted for the status quo. We can't pretend that didn't happen. 2 of the 4 constituent nations of the UK voted for the status quo. They have their voice that needs to be heeded. So, we don't have a mandate for anything precipitate or radical or unilateral. We will want to go ahead with the consent of our European allies, and wherever possible, carrying with us the majority of the British people, not just the 52% who voted to leave.
So when these senior European figures say we don't want to wait, let's get on with the negotiations, uncertainty is in nobody's business, you think that we'll be able to talk them out of that?
Well, it was very clear even before this referendum began that there was always a deal on offer for us of being in the market but outside political union. And this was even from the most hardline federalists. Jacques Delors called it privileged partnership. Guy Verhofstadt called it associate membership, and the idea was that we'd be part of the free movement of goods and services, but outside the political stuff, the citizenship and so on. Now, I'm in no doubt that that's still on offer. It's a question of getting there amicably and with a transition that, as I say, has a maximum consensus behind it in this country, and that is, of course, fair to our friends and allies as well, in a timescale that suits both sides.
Who would be best equipped to lead these negotiations on the British side?
Well, I mean, it can't be Sir Humphrey in Brussels. They are the people who created the mess in the first place. Had the Prime Minister got a different deal, this referendum would not have produced the outcome it did. So we can't have the same Foreign Office grandees repeating their mistake. There needs to be, I think, a group of people who represent the will of the British people. Now, of course, as I say, taking into account the fact that it was a narrow result, taking into account that quite a lot of what we've done is going to stay in place, we're not going to rip everything up, and it'll be a cumulative and gentle repatriation of power, because the day we leave is the day we can start to change things.
Damien Green, do you think that is a realistic approach to negotiations, or does not take into account the hard line that the European Union members could well take?
Well, we can't know yet what they will take, or indeed whether there'll be a united front. I mean, one of the problems with the European debate in this country is that it's always posed as Britain versus a bloc. On the other side, there are 27 different countries who will have their own different interests in the renegotiation. I think the problem with Dan's sort of outline of what should happen is the degree of the length of time of uncertainty there would be. I mean, inevitably we're seeing market chaos, as was predicted today. And clearly, I think it was inevitable that the Prime Minister had to stand down as well. But that in itself delays everything by a few months, because clearly you need a new Prime Minister.
Who would you like to see head the negotiations?
Well, I think that in the end the negotiations have to be led by the new Prime Minister. I mean, I think if you're Angela Merkel,
Boris Johnson then?
Well, let's see who the runners and riders are first before we get into
if
that
not
debate.
Him, who?
Well, I suspect there will be a lot of people who put their hats in the ring.
Yeah, but if not him, who?
Well, there are a number of people, and
they may stand, but who's going to beat him?
I don't know, because I don't know who's going to stand, and until I know who's going to stand, it's a slightly difficult question to answer.
Chris, Leslie, we haven't quite got a clip of this, but we've just seen the text of a letter that Margaret Hodge, a leading Labour backbencher, has sent to for consideration of the Parliamentary Labour Party at its next meeting, which I suspect will be Monday night, and it's submitting for urgent consideration that the Parliamentary Labour Party has no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Parliamentary Labour Party. The Prime Minister is going. Is Mr Corbyn's leadership in crisis?
Well, I mean, obviously this is a pretty seismic event for the whole country, and I think obviously our first priority has to be to make sure that we respond to this challenge in the appropriate way. But there's certainly some issues from this for the Labour Party. I'm not actually surprised that colleagues from across the Parliamentary Labour Party are starting to think about that. It sounds to me like it's a motion for debate. We had one of these, I think, back in January or whenever, where MPs in the PLP vote on a particular question, like a motion you would have at an ordinary meeting.
Would you vote for this motion?
Well, it sounds like a standard no confidence motion. Well, for me, there seem to be 2 or 3 key things that would mean I'd have to weigh them up. For a start, did Jeremy Corbyn manage to speak to our core support across the country? Did he mobilise that support in what the whole of the Labour Party conference, the PLP and others were saying should be voted in? I think there was a failure there. Has Jeremy got the ability to reach out, to build? If we're having an earlier general election, it could be within 4 months rather than 4 years. So these are serious times. I think there are worries about that. But for me, it's about having an opposition party that can speak to the concerns and the challenges that the public have been saying, whether that's about immigration or whatever those are. And, it's no secret I didn't nominate or vote for Jeremy Corbyn. And so I would say today he does need to consider his position and think about whether he should do the honourable thing.
Sounds like you're voting for this motion, yeah?
Well, every MP is going to have to search their conscience about it. But
yes or a no from you.
I think I would need an awful lot of persuading to have a confidence in Jeremy's leadership to go into a general election.
We'll leave it there, gentlemen. Thanks. Lots to get on with today. Let's go back to Sophie in Downing Street.
Andrew, thank you very much. Well, one of the immediate concerns this morning was the city, the financial markets, how they would react. And they certainly did react, because as the result became clear, the pound plunged its biggest one-day drop for decades. The Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has sought to reassure financial markets, and he said that the bank was well prepared. Well, Ben Thompson is monitoring the markets in the city. What has been happening in the last hour or so? Are markets rallying?
Yeah, Sophie, that's right. We often talk about roller coasters on the markets, but today that all too evident here, and I'll take you straight to the ball because this is what happened to the pound, and you can see pretty evident overnight as news of that Leave victory started to filter through to the pound. You can see then over the course of the morning it managed to stabilise somewhat, winning back some of those losses, but you'll notice in the last few minutes as New York and as America wakes up to that news that the UK is to leave the European Union, it's starting to lose ground once again. I just want to take you to what the equity markets are doing, and you can see across Europe, this is the picture. And what's interesting, the FTSE 100 currently down 4.5%, but it's over in mainland Europe, we're seeing bigger losses. Losses in Frankfurt and Paris. You can see the market there in Frankfurt down more than 7%, also in Paris as well, down 8.7%. So lots of concern, lots of volatility. Some of the biggest losers, we should say, on the London market, things like the airlines, house builders, retail stocks, all down pretty sharply as a result. So why? Well, let's speak to Alex Stewart, who is from Schroders. She's with me this morning. Alex, hello.
Hi.
Let's talk about this volatility because we've seen a lot of it this morning.
Yes.
Is this just a knee-jerk reaction, or is it markets really starting to factor in a new reality and a new reality for the City of London?
Definitely. I mean, up until yesterday, there was a lot of confidence that it was going to be a Remain vote. The bookies were saying that it was something like an 80% chance. So clearly this has come as a bit of a shock to certain parts of the market. And now it's just a case of digesting it and trying to work out what it means.
Have we swapped one set of uncertain issues for another? Because the City was looking towards today. We would have a vote in or out. We now know what that decision is, but it strikes me we've just got a whole lot more uncertainty to come.
Well, we know we've got a leadership election coming up imminently, and then the negotiations start with the EU, and we've no idea what any kind of form of the agreement is going to take. So the uncertainty is going to be around for a while longer now.
What does any of this matter to the average person? Because is this just bankers sat in their offices talking about a future, or is this real stuff that will affect all of us in our pockets?
I mean, immediately you're not going to notice a difference other than maybe buying your holiday money in terms of obviously the impact on sterling. But, you know, things will continue as normal until there's a renegotiation. But yes, I mean, the value's been wiped off the equity market. It's going to be more difficult for companies to fund. But the Bank of England are standing ready to support the banking system, so there shouldn't be a problem there in terms of liquidity. But as I say, we all have to just take stock just now and try and work out what does this mean for economic growth, what does it mean for inflation, what does it mean for interest rates.
Alex, for now, thanks very much indeed. Alex Stewart there at Schroders. So we're going to stay here all day, keep a very close eye on what happens, and crucially, we saw what happened in Asia, we've seen what's happening in Europe, we'll keep a close eye on that. But crucially, it's just turned 7:20 in New York. We'll get an indication about what markets there are thinking a little later. Back to you.
Ben Thompson, we will be back with you for that. Thank you very much. Well, we have gathered a panel of voters, those who wanted to remain, those who wanted to leave. They're in Manchester with Victoria Derbyshire, and we join her now.
Yes, and voters have been, it has to be said, really exercised about the possibility of a second independence referendum in Scotland. We are mostly here with voters from the northwest of England, it should be pointed out. Suzanne, you voted to leave. When you were watching Nicola Sturgeon hold her news conference, you were cross. Why?
I was just really angry. I'm furious, to be perfectly frank with her, because they've already had the referendum in Scotland. They decided to stay as part of the UK. The UK's voted, and this is the decision. And
right.
What we need at this point is unity. We don't need Nicola Sturgeon trying to hijack the whole process so that she can become the independent leader of Scotland.
Right, but it's all right for you to vote for Britain to leave Europe, but Scotland can't vote to leave the UK?
I think at the moment they've had that referendum. They want to be part of the UK, and the UK has made that decision. I think in the future, if they want to change that, then that's something to think about in the future. But at the moment, we need stability, and she's completely wiping that away.
Well, at the end of the day, the Scottish people have a democratic mandate. At the end of the day, the majority of Scots voted to remain in the European Union. Now, the fact that English and Welsh voters have dragged the Scottish people out of the European Union, it gives them that mandate. And I believe they should have the second referendum. Obviously, I want Scotland to stay as part of the UK, but the Scottish people must decide.
Yeah. You got a vote last time. You voted for independence for Scotland, didn't you?
I did. Part of the reason that I chose to vote for Scottish independence was on the basis that I suspected there would be an EU referendum, and that I suspected the rest of the UK would choose to leave the EU. Whilst I won't have a vote next time, I imagine that will be one of the major talking points for Scottish people to consider.
All right, let me ask people who support Labour here. 2 Labour MPs have tabled a motion of no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader. What do you think, Stuart?
I'm not surprised in one sense. I'm surprised on the timing of it and how quickly it's come about. But I think it was inevitable he would come under pressure to either resign or somebody would come forward and force that.
But do you have confidence in your Labour leader?
Not particularly at the moment, because he was very quiet throughout the campaign for whatever reason that he chose.
Other Labour supporters?
Yeah, I think it's a panicky reaction from the usual suspects, the Blairites, who've been looking for an opportunity at any time to put in a no-confidence motion. I think we've got to really wait and watch and do real introspection, what went wrong, before we start talking about no-confidence motion.
Okay.
It'll be hard to convince the base to go in a different direction when the clear majority of Labour members voted overwhelmingly for Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes.
And if Boris Johnson ends up being the next Conservative Prime Minister, would Jeremy Corbyn be the right man to go head-to-head to him in a general election?
Boris is one of the most popular politicians in the country. I think any Labour MP will have a difficult job leading the party in a general election in that fight.
And we will elect perhaps a buffoon as the Conservative Party leader and a Prime Minister.
Well, I know as a Tory voter, obviously still sad about Mr Cameron. I'm not too sure that Boris is the presumptive new Prime Minister. There are very talented people within the Conservative Party. They will rally around proper, and maybe even a woman this time.
All right, thank you for the moment. More later.
Victoria, thank you very much. Scotland, Victoria talking there about Scotland at the beginning, and Scotland, as we know, voted overwhelmingly to stay in the European Union. Let's now give you a proper breakdown of how the entire United Kingdom voted yesterday. Christian Fraser has been looking through the numbers in detail.
Let's take a look at those numbers then in greater detail. We'll start with England, shall we? Over 28 million votes cast on Thursday. Turnout 73%. They did think a high turnout would be good for Remain. Well, that's the highest turnout since 1992 in a nationwide vote. The margin of victory, 6 points for Leave. The pollsters, the city, the bookies, they all got it wrong because they didn't understand what was going on in rural England and in these key Labour supporting areas in the north and northwest of the country. The maroon bits of yellow, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, York, Harrogate, more affluent areas of Yorkshire, of course, and Newcastle, but only by the slenderest of margins. London, as we said, almost wholly voting for Remain, but not all parts of the south. Some key areas in Kent there in blue. Let's have a look at Scotland. Very different picture, of course. All 32 authorities voting for Remain. 2.7 million people voted in Scotland, so the turnout lower than the UK average. Voter fatigue? Possibly. They've had 4 elections in Scotland in under 2 years. But you can see the result is overwhelming. 62% for Remain against 38%. Edinburgh, 74% in favour of Remain. And that is what is opening up this debate again about a Scotland independence vote. Similar story and picture in Northern Ireland. 790,000 people voting in Northern Ireland. Turnout slightly lower than the UK average. But look at this, all the yellow areas around the border regions. 3 out of 4 areas in Belfast voting for Remain. In Wales, big turnout, but only 5 of the 22 areas voting for Remain. Cardiff, yes. Swansea, no. Areas like Merthyr Tydfil, Newport, Caerphilly, big Labour areas all going for Leave. In fact, let me show you the key Leave supporting areas in the country. 2 of them in Lincolnshire at the top of the pile. So here you go, Boston, South Holland in Lincolnshire, Castle Point in Essex, Thurrock and Great Yarmouth, big UKIP supporting areas. Top 5 remaining, no surprise, Gibraltar there at the top, almost overwhelmingly in favour of Remain. Lambeth, Hackney and Haringey, the London boroughs, foil there in Northern Ireland. Remember, you can check all the results on our website, bbc.co.uk/news.
Christian Fraser, thank you very much. We are going to Burnley in Lancashire now. Our correspondent Ed Thomas is there. He's been gauging reaction to the referendum result. He's at a hairdresser's. Ed.
Yeah, Sophie, 2 out of 3 people here in Burnley voted to get out of the European Union. Speak to people in this town today. They use words like celebration, time for a party, we've got our power back. This is a town shaped by immigration. Some of the most deprived areas in the country are right here in Burnley, and passions were running high here, and none less so than here in this hairdressers. Every single person in here voted. Michael, very quickly, how are you feeling today? You voted out, didn't you?
I voted out. I feel quite pleased about it, although I didn't expect it. I certainly didn't think we would win. But
what was it that drove you to vote out?
Well, because I've never been a lover of the European Union, in the sense I always feel that I need to be able to vote for an MP, and if I don't want it, I can kick him out. There's no democracy. They're unelected people that run it, and the MEPs really are just a floor show. And I feel that we're better off being run by our own people, and was what we always have been.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Okay. Thanks for talking to us. Further down here, a very different feeling. Hilary, what are your thoughts today?
I'm just worried that about the economy and jobs and terrorists, that we won't get information.
Uncertainty.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah, thank you, Hilary. Let you get back to getting your hair cut. Hilary is in the minority, though. Stacey, very quickly, 1 second. What were your emotions when you woke up this morning?
I was shocked at first because I honestly didn't think that we'd actually be out, but in a way I'm very happy. I think we can take back our control, and hopefully the NHS will pick up, and I hope they'll live up to what they've said they're going to do, really, and that's like improve everything that we've got to do.
And is that what you were thinking when you voted for exit? Were you thinking of the NHS?
Yes,
were
I
you
was.
thinking of immigration?
Yes, I was, yeah. I have a lot of dealings with the NHS. Member of the family will be there throughout the whole of their lives. So, yeah, it makes a massive difference to me. Like, I know what Nigel Farage said this morning, that basically told a lie, but it's got to be better than what it is now. So.
Okay. All right, Stacey. Everyone else, thank you very much for speaking to us. A loud and a clear message here from the majority of people in Burnley, across East Lancashire as well. They are happy with the UK voting out of the European Union.
Ed Thomas in Burnley, thank you. The time is 12:30. You're watching a BBC News special following the EU referendum. Let's go now to my colleague Joanna Gosling in the BBC Newsroom.
After more than 40 years, the UK is to end its membership of the European Union. The decision has been decisive, with the Leave campaign securing its victory by a margin of more than 1 million votes. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, has said he will step down, and a new Prime Minister will be in place within months. In total, 17.4 million people voted for the UK to leave the EU. That compares with the 16.1 million voters who backed Remain. Turnout was 72%, which is the highest level in a nationwide ballot in the UK since 1992. As the UK woke up to the news that it is to exit the European Union, Leave campaigners began celebrating. UKIP's leader Nigel Farage led those in Westminster, saying June the 23rd should now be regarded as Britain's Independence Day. Those from the Remain camp described the result as a catastrophe. Supporters of Remain consoled each other as the campaign received lower than expected support across swathes of England, including the Midlands and the North. Speaking outside Downing Street, David Cameron said he will resign as Prime Minister with a new leader appointed by October.
I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction. I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination. This is not a decision I've taken lightly, but I do believe it's in the national interest to have a period of stability and then the new leadership required. There is no need for a precise timetable today, but in my view, we should aim to have a new Prime Minister in place by the start of the Conservative Party conference in October.
One of the politicians who led the campaign to leave, the former Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, paid tribute to David Cameron as one of the most extraordinary politicians of our age. Mr. Johnson also said that in the future, Britain would benefit from the vote to leave.
There is simply no need in the 21st century to be part of a federal system of government based in Brussels that is imitated nowhere else on earth. It was a noble idea for its time. It is no longer right for this country. And it is the essence of our case that young people in this country can look forward to a more secure and more prosperous future if we take back the democratic control that is the foundation of our economic prosperity. I believe we now have a glorious opportunity. We can pass our laws and set our taxes entirely according to the needs of the UK economy. We can control our own borders in a way that is not discriminatory, but fair and balanced, and take the wind out of the sails of the extremists and those who would play politics with immigration.
More than 62% of people in Scotland voted to stay in the EU. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, says that meant the option of a second referendum was on the table.
When the Article 50 process is triggered in 3 months' time, the UK will be on a 2-year path to the EU exit door. If Parliament judges that a second referendum is the best or only way to protect our place in Europe, it must have the option to hold one within that timescale. That means we must act now to protect that position. I can therefore confirm today that in order to protect that position, we will begin to prepare the legislation that would be required to enable a new independence referendum to take place if and when Parliament so decides.
Well, the political ramifications have extended to the Labour Party as well. 2 of its MPs have submitted a motion of no confidence in their leader. Jeremy Corbyn is criticised for his handling of the referendum campaign by Margaret Hodge and Anne Coffey. They've written to the chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Their motion has no formal force, but it calls for a discussion at the next meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party on Monday. If accepted, it would be followed by a secret ballot of Labour MPs next Tuesday. In the past hour, the US presidential hopeful Donald Trump has given his reaction. Speaking at the opening of his Turnberry Golf Resort in Ayrshire, he said the US and Britain will continue to be close allies.
I don't know, first call or second call, there'll be a very powerful call. It's going to be a great relationship. There'll be great allies. They always have been. And I think zero will change on that score. There's never been a better ally, and I think nothing will change.
European leaders have called for stability in the coming months. The President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, said the other 27 countries in the EU were determined to remain united. The German Foreign Minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, called it a sad day for Europe and Britain. So what does happen next? Our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale, explores the options.
For weeks they've been at it, in streets and studios up and down the land. But now the hurly-burly of the campaign's over and we've voted for Brexit. So what happens now? Well, in practical terms, nothing. Britain is still a member of the European Union. David Cameron will still have to attend EU summits and will still have to follow EU rules. But there'll be lots to discuss. Under the rules set out in the Lisbon Treaty, Britain will have at least a couple of years to negotiate 2 things. The terms of our withdrawal, such as the rights of EU citizens in the UK and half-used EU budgets, and then our future trade relationship with the EU, in particular whether the UK remains in the single market.
The procedure for leaving the European Union is quite a long one. It's laid down in Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty of 2008, and that provides for a period of up to 2 years in which there'll be a negotiation between Britain and the other 27 on how we leave. Those negotiations will not necessarily be on Britain's future relationship with the European Union. That would require a trade agreement. This is a withdrawal agreement. It will deal with technical matters.
And even once a deal is done with the EU, it will still have to win the approval of largely pro-EU MPs and peers in a process that some fear could last years. And then there'll be even more trade deals to hammer out with non-EU countries.
It was a very long parliamentary process ahead. I think one of the other things is lots of things that haven't been issues in British politics are going to become issues again because those powers have returned from Brussels. For example, we haven't really had discussions about trade deals in British politics. You know, is it in the interest of farmers for this deal to go ahead?
In the meantime, EU leaders will gather in Brussels to discuss how they deal with Britain leaving and the price they demand in return. Will they want a quick divorce to minimise disruption, or a long and painful separation to deter others from going the same way. The key point is that this vote for Brexit is just the start of a process. People have voted to leave. It's now up to the politicians to work out what that means in practice. And that will take time, many hard battles, but the decisions they make will affect us all. James Landau, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's go back to Andrew Neil now with reaction live at Westminster. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. Here we are in the BBC platform in the heart of the media village, surrounded by the world's media across the road from the Houses of Parliament, crowds out on the streets, cameras everywhere, curious bystanders. We even had a little demonstration. We have for you Carolyn Fairbairn, head of the CBI, who campaigned very strongly to remain, and John Redwood, Conservative MP, who campaigned just as strongly to leave. Welcome to you both. British business, certainly your members, were by and large for remain. That's not going to happen. What does British business have to do now?
So, I mean, this is a momentous day for the country, but it is also a momentous day for British business. As you say, this is not the outcome that they wanted, but they respect the decision and they will just, they're standing ready to do what they can to make it work. You know, British business is resilient. It understands change. It can adapt. What they want is as much certainty as is possible. And I think some of the things we've seen this morning in terms of the Bank of England and the Prime Minister's announcement of a timetable has really helped. But they now want to see action around certainty, and they want to see real engagement on putting together a negotiating agenda that will work for British business.
Do you think it is still possible to have largely the access to the single market that we have at the moment, but not to be in the EU?
I think that is what we have to get. It's challenging. We know that. There isn't a model that delivers that without free movement of labour. And I think that is the conversation that we now need to have. And again, business, I think at a sector by sector and region by region level, is just ready to engage with that, to set out what its priorities are. But access to the single market is absolutely at the top of the list.
John Redwood, given the importance that immigration seems to have played in this referendum, particularly with Labour voters in the Midlands and in the North, it would surely be inconceivable that in the negotiations the British government would agree to free movement being the price of continued access to the single market. So we won't get continued full access to the single market.
Well, who knows? You're certainly right that the sacred flame of the public will includes us having our own immigration controls and reducing the numbers coming to low-paid jobs from the continent of Europe, and that isn't negotiable. And not paying contributions is very central because we wish to spend that money on our own jobs and our own priorities. Apart from that, we're pretty flexible, and I entirely agree with the CBI that none of us wish to damage business. We wish to maintain as much access as possible. I think it should be possible to have more access than America or Japan has to the single market, but of course they have a lot of access anyway from outside. But we start from the position where we have the full European style access, and unless somebody wants to change it, why can't it just continue?
Carolyn Fairbairn said that business needs certainty. If you're not going to trigger our exit process for quite some time, certainly not before the autumn, I've heard talk that it may even not be till next year, and then you have a 2-year negotiation process, that uncertainty is the one thing you can't deliver.
Well, you can never get rid of all uncertainty. Business also thrives on uncertainty and manages change. And I know big businesses say they don't like uncertainty, but every day they have uncertainty. There's going to be a very important Spanish election in a few days' time. That creates a lot of uncertainty on the European continent. But what we want to do, and you know, we thought this through and done a lot of homework on it, is we wish to achieve the main changes we want by fairly early legislative change in the United Kingdom. And a lot of us don't think there's any need to trigger Article 50 any time at all.
Anytime?
No. We would secure our own objectives in our United Kingdom way, and they'd be quite modest from the single market point of view, and sit down any time to discuss with our former European partners, but at a timetable and an agenda of mutual choice.
Well, I wonder what the reaction of Europe or the EU will be to that. Bang goes your certainty.
Well, I think business really needs to understand that. And I say we have welcomed this idea of there being a period where we can get ready, we can get our ducks in the row.
Trigger it right away.
So I mean, we really welcome that. But I have to say, it is somewhat concerning to now hear all sorts of different possible mechanisms for leaving. And I think the sooner we can settle down and understand what the right mechanism for leaving is, the better.
Well, we set this out very clearly.
Okay, let me bring in Anna Supri. She's just joined us.
We think it's smoother for business.
She's
to do
the
it that
business
way.
minister. At least still is at the moment. Maybe until you get a new leader.
Well, do you know something I don't know?
No, you're getting a new leader, so there will probably be a reshuffle, and you maybe move to another job. How are you going to handle this? You're the business minister.
Oh, I think this is a dreadful day. Two fronts. Dreadful day for our economy. I think it's also a dreadful day for our country.
Is it wise to say it's a dreadful day as a business minister?
Yeah, but
to talk it
notwithstanding that, I've already had a meeting with my boss, with Sajid Javid. He's already had the sorts of conversations you'd expect with trying to put some confidence back into the markets, to try to put some stability into things. We've heard from Mark Carney and so on and so forth. So, of course, you asked me about what sort of day it is. I am a very sad person. Today, it's one of the worst days of my life. To find my country leaving the EU, something I have always believed in, and then to see the loss of my Prime Minister.
I understand that, but we've had the referendum and you lost it.
Exactly.
So let's try and look forward.
And now
when
we
would
have
you
project
like
reality.
to see the Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which begins the exit process? It's a 2-year process, but the clock ticks when you press that button.
Exactly right.
When?
I don't know the answer to that question. It would be silly of me to say that I do. I think what has happened now is that the country's made a decision, that people who have responsibility for that decision, who may well end up leading my party, we know that we won't, the Prime Minister said we won't trigger it until after we have a new leader. And so it's for that new leadership to now take responsibility for the campaign and going forward.
John Redwood, and then I'll come back
and
very
I find
briefly.
it quite astonishing, if I may say, because we said this, we were accused of saying that this was all Project Fear. Project Fear is now turned into Project Reality, and there is no plan. But we are where we are. We have to move forward, and we have to unite
as you
also
say, we
as
are
a country.
Where we are. When do you think we'll actually leave the EU?
Well, I think we will secure our objectives within the year if we proceed on the route I'm talking about.
But when will we leave?
Our objective is to have a wide range of collaborations, plenty of trade, plenty of investment,
but when will we leave?
Not to damage business. Well, an awful lot of other countries around the world.
No, hold on.
Don't
ignore Anna Supri's heckling and just answer my question. When do you think we'll leave?
Well, I've just told you that there's not one single act of leaving. I think we should move quickly to secure the objectives on our borders and our contributions, and we will discuss with the others, and they will have an influence on the timetable.
So we don't know yet.
But we've also said, Vote Leave also made very clear we wanted senior business people to be part of the top negotiating team because we think they have strengths
it would be
and
quite
we want to work
remarkable
with
if
them.
they weren't. Very briefly.
I share Anna Subri's sadness, but I think that we can give a more reassuring message than that. Business is good at getting on with things.
Very well, we shall leave it. We need to get on with things too. We'll just leave them talking there. Let's go to Victoria Derbyshire in Manchester.
Voters from both Remain and Leave have spent the morning here together, and I think it's worth just pausing for a moment to reflect, to acknowledge what has happened in our country.
I think there's lots of people who voted yesterday who are very scared, who are concerned for the future of their country. It's a historic day. It's also, possibly a great opportunity for the future for our country. And I think lots of our elected politicians now need to come together, need to put the country first against their personal self-interest.
Okay.
And that's the way forward.
Who would agree with that?
Yes, I think it's been a very, very divisive campaign in my view. It's high time we unite the country and try and sort of protect the jobs, protect the public services, particularly NHS. I think in my view, NHS is in huge threat from either financial consequences of this or the people working from the EU.
Okay.
We have I think one of the best things of this is there's been a huge turnout, and it's been a brilliant day for democracy.
Yeah.
However, and look at the people together. We were all divided. If we can stand together, then the country has to stand together. But what we have to reflect on is the ethics, the morality that was behind the campaigns. That has to change. If we're going to work together on this island, we have to be united together, whatever race, immigration, refugees, whatever.
I would take a different stance actually about this being a good day for democracy, and whilst so many people have voted, there have been so many people which have been deprived the right to vote, including EU citizens and actually 16, 17-year-olds, which are going to have to live with this decision the longest.
Another reason is because Britain will have to start a kind of a huge domestic integration to foster unity among all the between Northern Ireland, Scotland, and the rest of the other parts of the United Kingdom. So, which is a very huge and a very long process for integration.
Are people genuinely worried about this, the division issue, the unity issue? Really?
Yeah. The thing is, we have to look at who's being targeted. It's all well and good for people who want to leave, saying, "Oh, we're not affected because you're not the one who's targeted." It's the immigrants, it's the refugees. Those people are deeply affected, and they're the ones who get disenfranchised, and they're the ones who will be pushed away out of democracy.
And working class people as well.
And working class.
Yes,
so
that's the most important.
So what we need to do is we need to figure out a way that we can bridge it, because this doesn't just go away.
Okay, Naomi, what do you want to happen next? What do you think?
I'm still in shock. I just think, like everyone else is sort of saying, I think we all need to sort of stand together now and try and sort out this mess.
Hang on, why do you say it's a mess?
Well, you look at what we've had announcements today, so obviously I'm devastated that we've left. David Cameron, I'm not a huge fan of him, but he's sort of standing down as Prime Minister. Potentially we're going to have Boris the buffoon. And, you know, obviously Nicola Sturgeon is now saying that she wants to break apart from the UK, which is, I think, is a really sad thing. But I do, you know, appreciate some of the things that she does have some points.
Right. When Boris Johnson said at his news conference how sad he was that David Cameron had to step down, what did you think? So we've got leave and remain here. Nobody believes in what he said.
I think he's been very, very opportunistic about this entire campaign. And I think, you know, the remarks he's made, the people he's sided and shared platforms with, you know, for me, I don't think he really honestly means that.
Okay, I want to hang on. Yes. I want to. If we let's put the politicians aside for one moment.
Okay.
Do you admire the way your family, your friends, the people you work with have argued, debated over the last few months?
Absolutely.
I think it's the first time anybody's had a straight yes and no, because normal elections, it's about different political persuasions, isn't it? This was supposedly outside of politics. It was about a yes or no about the EU. So it was a clear yes or no. And my concern now is yes, we've got the results, but we can't have a period where nobody makes any decisions till they decide who's going to be the next Prime Minister, if there's going to be an election, if there's going to be a new Labour leader. You've got all of that, but the country's still got to run, hasn't it, in that period?
We have to move forward from today. The country's decided, we've made the decision. I was for Remain, most of the country was for leave, but today we're all British and we all need to move forward to ensure that the right result happens.
Well, there's the wisdom of Solomon for you.
Yes.
Yeah. A young man as well.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, this is a time for reflection, and what is nice about this is everybody here is talked a little bit more civilly from the last time we all met. Let's be honest about that. So, you know, a little bit more civil. So I think everybody's becoming as well.
Okay.
I'll agree with that, and I'll say I'll urge people to be calm, make rational decisions, and let a strong leader emerge who can lead the process of change.
I want to thank you so much for your time this morning and your patience as well. Thank you very much. Really nice to see you all. Back to you.
Thanks, Victoria. Now, 2 Labour MPs have submitted a motion of no confidence in Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn following the referendum result. Margaret Hodge and Anne Coffey confirmed the move in a letter to the chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party. In the last few minutes, Margaret Hodge has been speaking to our deputy political editor, John Pinar.
I think Jeremy Corbyn should resign as leader of the Labour Party. This was a test of leadership, the European referendum campaign. He started too late. He was very half-hearted in the leadership he gave to Labour under it, and that resulted in Labour voters feeling that they hadn't got a clear message and didn't know where the Labour Party stood.
Well, we started the morning with the Prime Minister telling us he's resigning. Now we've got a challenge to the leader of the Labour Party. To review that and much more, we're joined by Trevor Kavanagh from The Sun and Polly Toynbee from The Guardian. Polly, Tommy, let me come to you first. Is Margaret Hodge right to do this, to put the Labour leadership now as a matter for dispute?
Depends whether she's really got the backing and whether it's possible to put this into effect. I think what's not in doubt at all is what a lousy, rotten campaign the Labour leadership fought, Jeremy Corbyn fought. Underneath it, on the ground, Labour was the only force out there knocking door to door. There were virtually no Tories. I mean, Labour's ground force worked damned hard. Those who did or didn't agree with their leadership, they were on the door. But Jeremy Corbyn's half-hearted approach, frankly, just no leadership at all. I don't think it was even to do with his ambivalence. He simply emerged as somebody who didn't have the nous to seize a moment. This could have been Labour's great moment. They could have been the virtually united party, passionately pro-European, making the case, and it was completely lost.
Trevor Kavanagh, yesterday, Downing Street during the day, from about mid-morning onwards, started briefing not just the media, but in cabinet ministers on Downing Street side, that they had won, that it was pretty much over, and that they had won pretty well. Not huge, but pretty well. What went wrong and why were they doing that?
Well, they were relying on the polls of Andrew Cooper, who has a shady record on polling results.
He's not alone in that, of course.
But the amazing thing is that they swallowed it hook, line and sinker, but not only did they swallow it, so did the Brexit campaign. They were very down in the mouth as the polls closed last night. Nigel Farage effectively conceded defeat, and then he withdrew that.
And then he did it again.
And then he,
withdrew that.
I went to bed.
Then you made a victory speech.
I snatched a couple of hours while everything was turning turtle. And
when I woke up and nothing had changed.
It had been totally different.
So they were just misled by the polls. What went wrong from you? Because you're a big supporter of Remain. What went wrong?
Just about everything. The Leave campaign had all the best tunes. It was very easy for them to look at the people who have been most harmed. In fact, ironically, by this government, by the cuts, by the austerity, by 1 million good council jobs lost, by huge cuts to tax credits, to all kinds of services locally. People feeling really disaffected were persuaded that foreigners were to blame. The foreigners in Europe, in Brussels, and the foreigners on their doorstep, new migrants. And that's a very easy, low kind of politics. It can be done in any country. If the soil is fertile enough, any disreputable politicians can use outsiders, race, foreigners, invaders to frighten people.
Wasn't it also, though, a sense that the British people wanted to give the political elite a bit of a bashing?
I think that's absolutely true. They've been brewing for a while, several years in fact, of feeling ignored or even betrayed. And it's not just here in Britain. It's not little England. This is not xenophobic Britain. This is happening right across Europe. And in fact, there is more cause for the sort of attitude that is being shown here in Britain in other countries, especially the southern part of Europe.
Where do we go from here? I mean, this country now has to kind of work out what sort of nation it's going to be outside the EU. So the debate doesn't end, does it?
The debate will go on painfully for years, for decades, and people will rewrite the history of this. Scotland will almost certainly be gone. Little England and Wales. It may have a referendum, but it may. I don't imagine they'll have a referendum till they're pretty sure of winning it this time.
That's also probably true.
So it may well be that Scotland's gone. Little England and Wales alone. I think, after all, 48% of people didn't want this to happen. There's only a 4% gap. I don't think it'll be long before a buyer's remorse switches that round a bit, enough for the country to feel very riven over whether this was a catastrophe or not.
But we're not going to have another referendum.
No, but it will be then. Who do you blame?
Well, that's not for me to blame anybody. Just we have 1 minute. Is Boris Johnson unstoppable now as the next Prime Minister?
I don't think he's unstoppable. He has to be the front runner, but I think anything could happen between now and October. At the moment, there are precious few other rivals. So I think he is a likely winner, but not necessarily.
Might be a total outsider, like David Cameron was. I would put some money on Anna Soubry. Hot performance today and all through this campaign.
A feisty lady, but not a Prime Minister.
I think she'd be a good fiery opponent, somebody coming out from left field.
Has to be someone who was in favour of Brexit.
No, you've got
yes, it does.
Somebody from the other side of the party.
wouldn't wear anyone else.
It's going to be a long, hot summer, isn't it?
It certainly is.
it's going to be appalling. It's going to be
It's going to be wonderful. The
He's smiling, and you look appalled, as you said. Anyway, we'll let you get on. We thank you both. And that's it from us here on the day the British people gave the British establishment the biggest bloody nose in living memory, perhaps in British history. It has already cost the Prime Minister his job, and Jeremy Corbyn now faces a motion of no confidence. The British government now has to negotiate the terms of the divorce, and Britain has to decide what kind of country it's going to be outside the EU. Bye-bye.